Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through history's most bizarre crimes, stories so strange that if they were fiction, you'd call them unbelievable. But here's the thing about reality. It's often far more absurd than anything we could imagine. Picture this. A modern military armed with machine guns and trained soldiers going to war against birds. Not just any birds, but 20,000 massive flightless creatures that would ultimately make the mighty Australian army look like amateurs. This isn't a fairy tale or some ancient myth. This actually happened in 1932, and by the end of it, the birds had won so decisively that it became one of the most embarrassing military defeats in modern history. What makes this even more incredible? The government officially declared this a war. They deployed real soldiers, spent taxpayer money, and issued military reports about their, shall we say, feathered adversaries. Before we dive into this wild tale together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange historical stories I'm passionate about sharing. And hey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? Are you cozy in bed? Or maybe somewhere completely unexpected? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back to 1932 Australia, where things were about to get very, very weird. Once upon a time in the vast Western Australian countryside, there lived a farming community that thought they'd seen everything. The year was in 32, and these hard-working folks were dealing with the aftermath of World War I and the crushing weight of the Great Depression. But little did they know, their biggest challenge wasn't economic. It was about to come running at them on two powerful legs, standing 6 feet tall and weighing up to 130 pounds each. The emus had arrived. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is an emu? Imagine if you took an ostrich, made it slightly smaller but significantly more stubborn, gave it powerful legs that could run 30 miles per hour, and then blessed it with the survival instincts of a creature that had been living in the harsh Australian outback for millions of years. These aren't your typical backyard chickens, folks. Every year, emus would migrate across Western Australia, and usually this wasn't much of a problem. But 1932 was different. The drought had been particularly brutal, and these 20,000 birds were desperately searching for food and water. And guess where they found the most attractive, well-watered, green fields? The wheat farms. Picture this scene. You're a farmer who's already struggling to make ends meet during the Great Depression. You wake up one morning, step outside with your coffee, and see what looks like a moving brown carpet covering your fields. Thousands upon thousands of massive birds calmly munching away at the crops that represent your family's survival for the next year. The farmers were understandably frustrated. These weren't small garden pests, these were enormous birds systematically destroying entire harvests. But here's where the story takes its first bizarre turn. Instead of calling pest control or wildlife management, the farmers did something that seems almost comical in hindsight. They called the military. And here's the truly remarkable part. The military said yes. Major GPW Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was assigned to lead what would officially become known as the Emu War. Can you imagine that conversation at military headquarters? "Sir, we need you to deploy to Western Australia." "What's the situation, Colonel?" "Well, birds, sir. Very large, very determined birds." On November the 2nd, 1932, Major Meredith arrived in the combat zone, and yes, I'm using military terminology because that's literally how they treated it, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was simple, or so they thought. Locate the enemy forces, engage in decisive battle, and eliminate the threat. The emus, however, had not read the military handbook. The first battle was a disaster that would be hilarious if it weren't so genuinely expensive for the Australian taxpayers. The soldiers positioned themselves and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. When a large group of emus came into range, they opened fire. Now, here's what they expected. The machine gun fire would scatter the birds, many would fall, and the rest would flee in terror, never to return. Here's what actually happened. The emus, upon hearing the gunfire, didn't panic like normal animals. Instead, they immediately scattered into smaller, more tactical groups. It was as if they instinctively understood that clustering together made them easier targets. Military strategists later noted, with what I imagine was considerable embarrassment, that the emus demonstrated better battlefield tactics than many human armies. But it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. The emus were incredibly difficult to hit. These birds could run at speeds up to 30 miles per hour, and they had an almost supernatural ability to zigzag unpredictably when under fire. Soldiers reported that even when they scored direct hits, the emus would often keep running as if nothing had happened. Their thick feathers and robust constitution meant that it sometimes took multiple shots to stop a single bird. After the first week of combat, the official military report stated that 986 rounds of ammunition had been fired, but only 200 emus had been confirmed eliminated. For those keeping Sierra at home, that's nearly 5 bullets per bird, not exactly the efficient military operation they'd envisioned. The media, naturally, had a field day with this. Newspaper headlines across Australia and around the world began mocking the situation. One particularly cruel editorial suggested that the emus should be awarded medals for their tactical superiority. Another newspaper declared that the emus had won the first round against the Australian military. Major Meredith, who was probably questioning his career choices at this point, requested reinforcements. The government's response was, well, let's just say it wasn't what he was hoping for. Instead of sending more soldiers, they recalled the operation entirely. But the story doesn't end there, because the farmers were still dealing with their emu problem. The military withdrawal left the farming community in the exact same situation they'd started in, except now they were the laughingstock of the international press. So they petitioned the government again, and incredibly, the government agreed to a second military operation. Round 2 began on November 13th, and this time the military was determined to show that humans could outsmart birds. They developed new strategies, better positioning, and what they hoped would be more effective tactics. The emus, apparently having learned from the first encounter, were even more elusive this time. The second operation lasted 10 days and resulted in approximately 40 emu casualties, despite hundreds more rounds of ammunition being expended. At this point, even the military had to admit defeat. The official report concluded that the operation was unsuccessful and that the birds appeared to employ guerrilla tactics. Let me repeat that. The Australian military officially stated that emus were using guerrilla warfare. The final casualty count was estimated at around 986 emus eliminated, but at the cost of thousands of rounds of ammunition, weeks of military time, and Australia's dignity on the international stage. Meanwhile, the emu population in the area remained largely intact and continued to raid farms whenever they pleased. Now, you might be thinking this is just a funny historical anecdote about human overconfidence versus animal instinct. And you'd be right, but it's also something much more profound. This wasn't actually a crime in the legal sense, but it represents one of history's most bizarre governmental decisions, the choice to militarize a wildlife management problem. What makes this story even more fascinating is how it reveals the complex relationship between humans and nature, especially when we assume our technology and organization will automatically triumph over natural adaptability. The real crime here might be the hubris, the absolute certainty that superior firepower would solve a problem that required understanding, patience, and ecological thinking instead of brute force. And here's the kicker that makes this story even more relevant today. While the military was failing spectacularly at emu control, local farmers eventually developed effective non-violent methods for protecting their crops. They used fencing, scare tactics, and sustainable farming practices that worked with the natural migration patterns rather than against them. The Great Emu War became a case study in how not to solve environmental problems, and it's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful military in a region can be completely outmatched by creatures that simply understand their environment better. But this is just the beginning of our journey through history's most bizarre crimes and peculiar human decisions. Because if you think declaring war on birds is strange, wait until you hear about what happened in 1518 when an entire city began dancing and couldn't stop. People danced until they collapsed, danced until they died, and nobody could explain why. That story is coming up next, and trust me, it makes the Emu War look absolutely rational by comparison. Now, if you thought the Australian military losing to emus was the pinnacle of human absurdity, let me take you back 5 centuries to a summer day in Strasbourg, France, where something far more sinister and inexplicable unfolded. Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbour dancing in the street. Not celebrating, not performing, but dancing with a desperate, frantic energy, as if her very life depended on it. Her feet are bloody, her face is twisted in exhaustion, but she cannot stop. And then, as the hours pass, more people join her, not by choice, but as if compelled by some invisible force. By the end of that summer, over 400 people were dancing themselves to death, and nobody, not the doctors, not the priests, not the authorities, could make it stop. This is the story of history's most bizarre mass crime against human sanity, and what makes it truly terrifying is that we still don't fully understand how or why it happened. The year was 1518, and Strasbourg was a prosperous city in the Holy Roman Empire. Life was relatively good compared to many places in medieval Europe. People had enough to eat, trade was flourishing, and the plague outbreaks that had devastated the continent in previous centuries seemed to be under control. Then, on a seemingly ordinary July morning, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out of her house and began to dance. According to the detailed chronicles kept by the city's authorities, and yes, they documented this meticulously because even then people knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, Frau Trophäa danced alone for an entire day. Her movements weren't joyful or celebratory. Witnesses described her as looking tormented and unable to control herself. She danced through the scorching summer heat. She danced as the sun set. She danced through the night, collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise and continue dancing. By the 4th day, something even stranger happened. Other people began joining her, not friends or family trying to help, but complete strangers who suddenly felt an irresistible urge to dance. Within a week, approximately 34 people were dancing continuously in the streets of Strasbourg. Now, here's where this story takes a turn from bizarre to genuinely tragic. The city authorities, faced with something completely outside their experience, made a decision that would haunt the city for months. They consulted with physicians and clergy, and based on their medieval understanding of medicine, they concluded that the dancing was caused by hot blood, and could only be cured by them more dancing. Let me repeat that. Their solution to people dancing themselves to death was to encourage them to dance more. The authorities hired professional musicians and built a stage in the public square. They even brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted individuals moving, believing that if they danced hard enough and long enough, they would eventually dance the disease out of their systems. It was like trying to cure a drowning person by throwing them deeper into the water. Dr. Paracelsus, one of the most respected physicians of the time, documented the event extensively. According to his records, which are housed in the Strasbourg City Archives, at the peak of the outbreak, more than 400 people were dancing simultaneously. The professional musicians played day and night in shifts because the afflicted literally could not stop moving. And here's the most chilling detail from the historical accounts. People were dying. The chronic fatigue, dehydration and exhaustion claimed lives daily. The city records, meticulously kept by scribe Daniel Specklin, note that several people died each day during the height of the outbreak. Some collapsed from heart attacks brought on by the continuous exertion. Others simply danced until their bodies gave out entirely. Can you imagine being a family member, watching your loved one dance themselves toward death, and being told by the authorities that the best thing you could do was hire more musicians to keep them moving? But here's what makes this story even more fascinating from a modern perspective. Similar dancing plagues had occurred throughout medieval Europe. Historian John Waller, in his extensively researched book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, documents at least 7 major dancing epidemics between 1374 and 1518, with smaller outbreaks continuing well into the 17th century. This wasn't an isolated incident of mass hysteria. It was a recurring phenomenon that medical historians are still trying to understand today. Modern theories about what caused these dancing plagues range from the scientific to the sociological, and each one offers a different perspective on how an entire community can essentially commit collective self-harm. One theory suggests ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, especially during wet summers, and it contains compounds similar to LSD. Historian Mary Kilbourne Matossian argued that the convulsive symptoms of ergotism could explain the uncontrollable dancing. But here's the problem with this theory. Ergot poisoning typically causes painful muscle contractions and gangrene, not the rhythmic, sustained movement described in the Strasbourg accounts. Another theory, proposed by neurologist Dr. Osvaldo Egas Muniz, suggests that the dancing plague was an early form of what we now call conversion disorder, a psychological condition where emotional stress manifests as physical symptoms. Given the social and economic pressures of 16th century life, this theory has gained considerable support among modern medical professionals. But perhaps the most compelling explanation comes from medical anthropologist Dr. Robert Bartholomew, who has spent decades studying mass psychogenic illness. His research, published in the journal Psychological Medicine, suggests that the dancing plague was a form of mass hysteria triggered by a combination of social stress, religious fervour, and what psychologists call social contagion. Think about it this way. Have you ever been in a situation where one person starts laughing uncontrollably, and suddenly everyone around them begins laughing too, even if they don't know what's funny? Or more recently, have you noticed how certain behaviours spread rapidly through social media, like the various challenges that periodically go viral? The same psychological mechanisms that make these modern phenomena possible were at work in medieval Strasbourg, but without our understanding of psychology or mass media to explain what was happening. What makes the dancing plague particularly tragic is how the authorities' response made everything worse. By providing music and encouraging the dancing, they essentially validated and amplified the very behaviour that was killing people. It's a perfect example of how good intentions, combined with poor understanding, can transform a crisis into a catastrophe. The outbreak finally ended in early September 1518, almost as mysteriously as it had begun. The city authorities, presumably realizing that their strategy wasn't working, decided to try a different approach. They banned all public dancing and music, and they organised religious processions and prayers instead. Within days, the compulsive dancing stopped. The official city records, translated by historian Ned Pennant Rea, state that by September 8, 1518, no new cases were being reported, and the remaining dancers had gradually returned to normal behaviour. But here's the question that still haunts historians and medical professionals today. Was this really a crime? And if so, who was the perpetrator? In one sense, no laws were broken. No one intentionally harmed anyone else. No property was stolen or destroyed. But in another sense, an entire community was robbed of their sanity, their health, and in many cases, their lives. And modern historians argue that the real crime was committed by the authorities who encouraged the dancing despite clear evidence that it was killing people. They had the power to stop it, the responsibilities to protect their citizens, and instead they actively made the situation worse. Others suggest that the crime was more subtle, a failure of community, education and understanding that allowed fear and hysteria to spread unchecked through a population that had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. What I find most unsettling about this story is how relevant it feels today. In our age of viral social media trends, mass hysteria events, and collective behaviour that spreads faster than we can understand it, the dancing plague of 1518 serves as a warning about how quickly rational people can become trapped in irrational collective behaviour. The people of Strasbourg weren't stupid or primitive. They were dealing with something that defied their understanding of the world, just as we sometimes struggle to understand the psychological forces that drive modern mass behaviour. And speaking of things that defy understanding, our next story takes us into the world of academic rivalry gone completely off the rails. Imagine two of the most respected scientists of their time becoming so obsessed with outdoing each other that they resorted to espionage, sabotage and outright theft. Their battlefield? The American West. Their weapons? Dynamite and deception. Their prize? Dinosaur bones that would make them famous or destroy their careers entirely. The Bone Wars were about to begin, and the casualties would extend far beyond scientific reputations. Speaking of collective madness, let me tell you about two men who took academic rivalry to such extremes that they literally destroyed each other's lives over rocks and bones buried in the ground for millions of years. Their names were Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, and on paper, they should have been the best of friends. Both were brilliant paleontologists, both came from wealthy families, both were respected members of the scientific community, and both shared an absolute obsession with dinosaurs during the golden age of American fossil discovery. Instead, they became such bitter enemies that their feud lasted over 30 years, bankrupted one of them, destroyed countless scientific careers, and turned the pursuit of knowledge into something resembling a criminal enterprise complete with espionage, sabotage, bribery and theft. But here's what makes their story so darkly fascinating. Their war gave birth to some of the most important paleontological discoveries in history, including the dinosaurs that still capture our imagination today. Triceratops, Stegosaurus and Allosaurus, just to name a few. So how did two respected scientists end up committing what amounted to organised crime in the name of science? The answer lies in the perfect storm of ego, money, and the intoxicating rush of discovery in the American West during the 1870s. The story begins innocently enough. In 1863, a young Othniel Marsh met Edward Cope at a scientific meeting in Philadelphia. According to Dr. Mark Jaffe's meticulously researched book The Gilded Dinosaur, the two men initially got along well. Cope even named a fossil species after Marsh as a gesture of friendship and professional respect, Marsh was methodical, cautious, and backed by his uncle's vast fortune, his uncle being the famous philanthropist George Peabody. Cope, on the other hand, was impulsive, brilliant, and driven by an almost manic energy that led him to publish scientific papers at a rate that seemed superhuman. By the end of his career, Cope had authored over 1,400 scientific publications. That's roughly one paper every 2 weeks for his entire adult life. Their friendship began to sour in 1868 over what seemed like a trivial matter. Cope had reconstructed a fossil marine reptile called Elasmosaurus and proudly displayed it at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. When Marsh visited to see the specimen, he noticed something that must have filled him with gleeful satisfaction. Cope had assembled the skeleton with the head on the wrong end. Rather than quietly pointing out the error, Marsh made sure to publicize Cope's mistake in front of other prominent scientists. Cope was humiliated, and according to paleontologist Dr. David Fostovsky's account in The Evolution and Extinction of the Dinosaurs, this incident created a resentment that would fester for decades. But the real war began in 1872 when both men set their sights on the fossil-rich badlands of the American West. The Transcontinental Railroad had recently been completed, opening up vast territories in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana that were literally littered with dinosaur bones just waiting to be discovered. This is where their rivalry transformed from academic competition into something far more sinister. Both men began hiring teams of fossil hunters, but instead of focusing on scientific methodology, they started focusing on speed and secrecy. They wanted to find dinosaurs faster than their rival, claim credit for the discoveries, and most importantly prevent their opponent from accessing the same fossil sites. Marsh, with his family fortune behind him, could afford to pay his crews well and keep them loyal. He established what amounted to a network of paid informants throughout the fossil hunting regions. According to historian Lucas Riepel's Assembling the Dinosaur, Marsh's field teams were instructed not just to collect fossils, but to actively sabotage Cope's operations. And here's where things get truly criminal. Marsh's crews would dynamite fossil sites after they'd collected what they wanted, making sure that Cope's teams couldn't recover anything useful from the same locations. They would spread false information about fossil discoveries to send Cope's expeditions on wild goose chases. They even resorted to stealing fossils that Cope's teams had already excavated and shipped to railway stations. But Cope wasn't about to be outdone in the dirty tricks department. He began bribing Marsh's workers to defect to his teams, often paying them double what Marsh was offering. According to the archive correspondence between Cope and his field supervisors, housed at the American Museum of Natural History, Cope explicitly instructed his men to acquire specimens by any means necessary. This led to what can only be described as paleontological espionage. Both sides employed spies to infiltrate the other's expeditions. They intercepted each other's mail to learn about new fossil sites. They bribed railroad workers to accidentally misdirect shipments of fossils. The situation became so chaotic that the US Geological Survey, led by John Wesley Powell, launched an official investigation into the conduct of both paleontologists. Powell's report, published in 1890, documented numerous instances of scientific misconduct, including falsified discovery locations, stolen specimens, and deliberate destruction of fossil sites. But perhaps the most absurd aspect of their feud was how it played out in the scientific literature. Instead of limiting their attacks to private correspondence, both men began using academic journals as weapons. They would publish papers not to advance scientific knowledge, but specifically to discredit each other's work. Cope in particular became obsessed with finding errors in Marsh's publications. He once spent an entire year meticulously examining every dinosaur reconstruction Marsh had ever published, compiling a 56-page document listing what he claimed were deliberate misrepresentations and scientific fraud. This document, known among paleontologists as Cope's Manifesto, was published in the New York Herald in 1890 and caused a sensation in both scientific and popular circles. Marsh responded with his own accusations, claiming that Cope had stolen fossils, falsified data, and published descriptions of dinosaurs based on incomplete specimens. The scientific community was forced to choose sides, and many promising careers were damaged simply by association with one side or the other. The human cost of their feud was staggering. Dr. Charles Knight, one of the most talented fossil illustrators of the era, saw his career destroyed when he was caught in the crossfire between the two rivals. Several promising young paleontologists left the field entirely rather than deal with the toxic atmosphere that Marsh and Cope had created. And here's the tragic irony. While they were spending their fortunes and reputations attacking each other, they were making discoveries that revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric life. Between them, they described over 30 dinosaur species. Marsh discovered the first American pterosaur and several complete skeletons of ancient horses that provided crucial evidence for evolution. Cope made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of prehistoric mammals and early reptiles. But their accomplishments came at an enormous cost. Cope spent his entire family fortune on fossil hunting and died virtually penniless in 1897. His final years were spent in a Philadelphia boarding house surrounded by boxes of unpublished research and fossil specimens that he couldn't afford to properly study or house. Marsh fared better financially, but his reputation never fully recovered from the scandal. When he died in 1889, the scientific community was still deeply divided about his contributions versus his conduct. Many of his most important discoveries were overshadowed by questions about how he had obtained them. The Bone Wars officially ended with Cope's death, but their impact on American paleontology lasted for generations. The competitive, secretive atmosphere they created led to new regulations about fossil collecting on public lands. It also established ethical guidelines for scientific fieldwork that remain in place today. Looking back, it's clear that Marsh and Cope committed crimes against scientific progress itself. They turned the pursuit of knowledge into a zero-sum game where winning mattered more than truth. They corrupted their students and colleagues, destroyed irreplaceable fossil sites, and set back paleontological research by decades through their refusal to share information or collaborate. Yet their story also reveals something fundamental about human nature and the dangerous allure of competition. These weren't evil men, they were brilliant scientists who became so consumed with beating each other that they lost sight of why they had become scientists in the first place. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where competition became more important than the thing you were competing for? Maybe it was a workplace rivalry that got out of hand, or an argument that escalated beyond all reason. The Bone Wars remind us how quickly the pursuit of excellence can become something destructive when ego and pride take over. But while Marsh and Cope were destroying each other over dinosaur bones in the American West, something even more bizarre was unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic. Because our next story involves a war that lasted 9 years, claimed thousands of lives, and reshaped international politics, all because of a single severed ear floating in a jar of brandy. The War of Jenkins's ear is about to begin, and by the time you hear how it started, you'll understand why sometimes the most catastrophic events in history have the most ridiculous origins. You know, we've talked about the wars fought over territory, resources, and ideological differences, but what I'm about to tell you might be the most absurd reason for international conflict in recorded history. Picture this: a single human ear severed, pickled, and preserved in a jar of brandy, becoming the spark that ignited a 9-year war between two global superpowers cost hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaped the balance of power in the Americas. The ear belonged to Captain Robert Jenkins, a British merchant sailor whose gruesome encounter with Spanish coastguards in 1731 would eventually drag Britain and Spain into a conflict so bizarre that historians still debate whether it actually happened the way it was reported. But here's the thing that makes this story so perfectly absurd. The war didn't start immediately after the ear incident. No, Jenkins carried that pickled ear around for 7 years, occasionally showing it to people at parties like some macabre conversation piece, until one day in 1738 someone had the brilliant idea to use it as a justification for declaring war on Spain. Let me take you back to that fateful day in April 1731, somewhere in the Caribbean waters between Jamaica and Cuba. Captain Robert Jenkins was commanding a British merchant vessel called the Rebecca, engaged in what was technically legal trade between British colonies. However, the waters of the Caribbean in the 1730s were a complex web of competing territorial claims, smuggling operations, and officially sanctioned piracy that made every merchant voyage a potential international incident. According to Jenkins' own testimony, later recorded in the official proceedings of the British House of Commons and documented extensively by naval historian Richard Harding in The Emergence of Britain's Global Naval Supremacy, the Rebecca was intercepted by a Spanish Coast Guard vessel commanded by Captain Julio Leon Fandino. The Spanish had been cracking down on what they considered illegal British trading in Spanish territorial waters. From their perspective, British merchants were systematically undermining Spanish colonial trade monopolies and engaging in large-scale smuggling operations that were costing the Spanish crown enormous amounts of revenue. From the British perspective, they had every right to trade in international waters and with British colonies, and Spanish interference with legitimate commerce was nothing short of piracy. So when Captain Fandino boarded the Rebecca and demanded to search the cargo, Jenkins initially complied. But according to the testimony Jenkins later gave to Parliament, documented in the Proceedings of the House of Commons from March 1738, the situation escalated quickly when the Spanish officers allegedly found evidence of illegal trading. What happened next depends entirely on whose version of events you believe. Jenkins claimed that when he protested the search and insisted on his rights as a British captain in international waters, Captain Fandino became enraged. According to Jenkins' account, Fandino ordered his men to tie Jenkins to the mast of his own ship, and then, in a fit of brutality that seems almost cartoonish in its cruelty, he personally drew his sword and sliced off Jenkins's left ear. But here's where the story becomes even more surreal. According to Jenkins' testimony, Fandino then held up the severed ear and declared, "Take this to your king and tell him that if he were here, I would serve him in the same manner." The Spanish version of events, preserved in the colonial archives in Seville and analysed by historian Dr. Maria Fernanda Garcia de los Arcos in Pirates and Smugglers in the Spanish Caribbean, tells a completely different story. According to Spanish records, Jenkins was engaged in clear smuggling activities, became violent when confronted, and was injured during a struggle with Spanish officers who were attempting to arrest him for violating Spanish colonial law. Regardless of what actually happened, Jenkins sailed back to London with his ear carefully preserved in a jar of brandy, and initially nothing came of it. The British government filed a formal complaint with Spain, the Spanish government responded with their own version of events, and the whole matter seemed destined to become just another diplomatic footnote in the ongoing tensions between the two powers. But then, 7 years later, everything changed. By 1738, British public opinion had become increasingly hostile towards Spain. British merchants were complaining loudly about Spanish interference with their trade. Opposition politicians were looking for any excuse to criticise the government's foreign policy. And most importantly, There were powerful commercial interests that saw a war with Spain as an opportunity to break Spanish control over lucrative trade routes in the Americas. This is when someone, and historians still debate exactly who, had the brilliant idea to drag poor Captain Jenkins and his pickled ear out of obscurity and turn them into a cause for war. On March 17th, 1738, Jenkins was summoned to appear before the House of Commons to give testimony about his encounter with the Spanish Coast Guard 7 years earlier. According to the parliamentary records, Jenkins dramatically produced his severed ear from the jar of brandy where it had been preserved, and told his story to a packed chamber of increasingly outraged British politicians. The scene, as described by historian Dr. Philip Woodfine in Britannia's Glories, was pure political theatre. Jenkins held up his ear and declared, "I committed my soul to God and my cause to my country." The chamber erupted in angry demands for war against Spain. But here's what makes this entire spectacle so suspicious. There's considerable evidence that the whole performance was orchestrated by British politicians who had already decided they wanted a war with Spain and were simply looking for a convenient justification. First, consider the timing. Why wait 7 years to seek justice for Jenkins's ear? Why did this suddenly become a national outrage in 1738 when it had been largely ignored since 1731? Second, consider the political context. The opposition politicians who were most vocal in demanding war over Jenkins' ear were the same politicians who'd been calling for aggressive action against Spain for completely unrelated commercial and territorial reasons. Third, and most damning, consider Jenkins himself. According to customs records uncovered by the maritime historian Dr. Anne Verdery, Jenkins had indeed been engaged in large-scale smuggling operations throughout the Caribbean. His claims of innocence were almost certainly false, which means his entire testimony to Parliament was built on lies. But none of this mattered to the British public, who had been whipped into a frenzy of anti-Spanish sentiment by newspapers and politicians who saw war as politically advantageous. On October 19, 1739, Britain formally declared war on Spain, ostensibly to avenge the mutilation of Captain Jenkins and defend British honour. The War of Jenkins' Ear, as it came to be known, lasted from 1739 to 1748, and eventually merged with the larger War of Austrian Succession. The human cost was staggering. According to military historian Dr. Reed Browning's research in the War of Austrian Succession, the conflict resulted in over 400,000 military casualties and countless civilian deaths from disease, famine, and economic disruption. The war reshaped the map of North America. It led to major British victories in the Caribbean and contributed to the eventual British conquest of French Canada. It also established British naval supremacy in the Atlantic and set the stage for Britain's emergence as the world's dominant maritime power. All of this because of one man's ear in a jar of brandy. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is how it reveals the mechanics of how wars actually start. We like to think that nations go to war for grand, rational reasons, to defend vital interests, to uphold important principles, to respond to genuine threats. The War of Jenkins' Ear shows us the truth. Wars often start for the most trivial reasons imaginable, driven by political opportunism, economic greed, and the willingness of leaders to sacrifice thousands of lives for the sake of their own power and prestige. Think about it. Have you ever seen a small argument escalate into a massive conflict simply because no one was willing to back down? Have you watched a minor disagreement spiral out of control because people's pride became more important than finding a solution? That's essentially what happened with Jenkins's ear. Except instead of a family feud or workplace drama, it became an international war that changed the course of history. The truly criminal aspect of this story isn't the original incident between Jenkins and the Spanish Coast Guard. Whatever actually happened there was probably just another example of the routine violence and lawlessness that characterized Caribbean trade in the 18th century. The real crime was committed by the British politicians who cynically manipulated public opinion, fabricated justifications for war, and sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths over what they knew was essentially a lie. But even as the British and Spanish were spilling blood over a severed ear, an even more sinister plot was unfolding in the heart of Nazi Germany. Because our next story involves what might have been the most successful criminal operation in modern history, a counterfeiting scheme so sophisticated and so devastating that it nearly brought down the entire British economy during World War II. Operation Bernhard was about to begin, and unlike Jenkins's ear, this crime was perpetrated by some of the most evil minds in human history, using some of the most talented victims they could find. Sometimes the most successful crimes are the ones that never get reported in the newspapers, never result in dramatic police chases, and are carried out not by hardened criminals, but by victims who had no choice but to become perfect at breaking the law. What I'm about to tell you is the story of the largest counterfeiting operation in human history, a scheme so sophisticated that it produced fake British pounds that were literally more perfect than the real ones. The criminal mastermind behind it, the Nazi SS, the victims forced to carry it out, some of Europe's most talented Jewish artists, engravers and printers, working under the constant threat of death. Operation Bernhard was designed to do something that no army, no air force, and no submarine fleet had been able to accomplish: completely destroy the British economy by flooding it with so much counterfeit currency that the pound sterling would become worthless. And here's the most chilling part: it almost worked. The story begins in 1942, deep within the Sachsenhausen concentration camp about 20 miles north of Berlin. Among the thousands of prisoners suffering under Nazi brutality was a man named Adolf Berger, a Slovak typographer whose only crime was being Jewish and possessing exactly the skills that would make him invaluable to one of the most audacious criminal schemes ever attempted. According to Berger's memoir, The Devil's Workshop, later corroborated by extensive documentation from the Sachsenhausen Memorial Archives, Berger and approximately 40 other prisoners were suddenly moved to a special isolated section of the camp in 1943. They had no idea why they'd been selected, but they were about to become unwilling participants in what SS Sturmbannführer Bernhard Krüger called the perfect crime. Krüger, whose personal files were captured by Allied forces and are now housed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., was not your typical Nazi officer. He was a criminal investigator who had spent years studying counterfeiting operations and had become obsessed with the idea of using fake currency as a weapon of economic warfare. His plan was breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly effective: force the most talented Jewish prisoners to create perfect counterfeit British pounds, then flood the British economy with so much fake money that inflation would spiral out of control. The currency would collapse, and Britain would be unable to finance its war effort. The workshop they created in Sachsenhausen was unlike anything that had ever existed. According to Lawrence Malkin's extensively researched book Krüger's Men, the Nazis invested the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern currency to create the most sophisticated counterfeiting operation in history. They acquired original British printing equipment, including actual plates from the Bank of England that had been stolen during bombing raids. They obtained genuine British paper by intercepting shipments and having their agents purchase authentic currency in neutral countries to study the manufacturing process. But the most crucial element was the forced labour of the Jewish prisoners, who were told in no uncertain terms that their survival depended on their ability to create perfect forgeries. Among these prisoners was Salomon Smolyanov, a Russian master engraver whose work before the war had been considered some of the finest in Europe. According to his testimony recorded by the USC Shoah Foundation, Smolyanov was initially horrified to realize what he was being asked to do, but quickly understood that resistance meant immediate death. The prisoners faced an impossible moral dilemma: create perfect counterfeits to help the Nazi war effort, or refuse and be murdered. Most chose survival, but they found subtle ways to resist the operation from within. Here's where the story becomes even more psychologically complex. The Nazis treated the counterfeiting prisoners better than almost any other prisoners in the camp system. They received adequate food, clean clothing, heated barracks, and even access to a library and musical instruments. They were, in the words of survivor Felix Cianciala, privileged slaves in hell. But this special treatment came with enormous psychological pressure. According to Dr. Robert Lifton's analysis in The Nazi Doctors, the prisoners lived with the constant awareness that their improved conditions existed only as long as they remained useful to their captors' criminal enterprise. The quality of their work was absolutely extraordinary. By 1944, according to Bank of England records declassified in the 90s, Operation Bernhard was producing counterfeit British pounds that were so perfect they passed every authentication test that existed at the time. In some cases, the fakes were actually superior to genuine British currency, because the prisoners had access to better quality paper and ink than the wartime British printing facilities. The operation's scale was staggering. According to documents from the German Federal Archives, Operation Bernhard produced over 8.9 million counterfeit British pounds, equivalent to approximately $100 million in today's currency. More importantly, they had the capacity to produce unlimited quantities, limited only by how quickly they could work. The Nazis began distributing the counterfeit currency through a network of agents and sympathizers across Europe and even into Britain itself. According to MI5 records released under the Freedom of Information Act, British intelligence began detecting small amounts of perfect counterfeit currency in 1943, but initially had no idea of the scope of the operation. By 1944, the situation had become so serious that the Bank of England was forced to quietly withdraw certain denominations from circulation and redesign others. According to former Bank of England Governor Montague Norman's private papers housed in the bank's archives, there were genuine fears that if the counterfeits reached a critical mass in circulation, they could trigger a crisis of confidence that would make British currency worthless. But here's where the story takes an ironic twist. The prisoners themselves began sabotaging the operation in subtle ways that the Nazis never detected. According to Adolf Berger's testimony, the prisoners deliberately introduced tiny imperfections into the plates and printing process, flaws so minor that they wouldn't be noticed by casual inspection, but which could be detected by experts who knew what to look for. They also worked as slowly as they dared, constantly claiming technical difficulties and the need for more time to achieve perfection. Most importantly, they managed to delay the production of counterfeit American dollars, which would have been far more devastating to the Allied war effort than fake British pounds. The prisoners knew that if they succeeded too completely, they would not only help the Nazi war effort, but also make themselves expendable. So they walked a careful line between producing work good enough to keep themselves alive and avoiding work so perfect that it would actually succeed in its intended purpose. The operation came to an abrupt end in April 1945 as Allied forces approached Sachsenhausen. According to survivor testimonies compiled by the Sachsenhausen Memorial, the Nazis attempted to destroy all evidence of Operation Bernhard and planned to execute all the prisoners involved. But in the chaos of the war's final weeks, most of the prisoners managed to survive, and much of the equipment and counterfeit currency was captured by Allied forces. Some of the fake pounds actually remained in circulation for years after the war ended. So perfect were the forgeries. The moral complexity of Operation Bernhard is staggering when you really think about it. The victims were forced to become accomplices in a scheme designed to harm the very countries that were fighting to liberate them. They had to choose between immediate death and participating in what amounted to economic terrorism. Yet their subtle resistance, their deliberate imperfections and delays, may have saved the British economy from collapse and helped preserve the Allied ability to finance the war effort that ultimately defeated Nazi Germany. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between doing something morally questionable and facing serious consequences? Most of us never face choices as stark as the prisoners in Operation Bernhard, but their story raises profound questions about survival, resistance, and the impossible moral calculations that people make under extreme circumstances. The survivors of Operation Bernhard spent the rest of their lives grappling with the psychological aftermath of their experience. Some felt guilt for their participation, even though they had no real choice. Others took pride in their subtle sabotage efforts that helped limit the operation's effectiveness. What strikes me most about this story is how it illustrates the Nazi regime's ability to corrupt everything it touched, turning victims into unwilling accomplices, transforming artistic talent into criminal activity, and weaponizing the very creativity and skill that should represent the best of human civilization. But while the Nazis were forcing Jewish prisoners to commit the perfect crime in the concentration camps of Germany, something equally devastating but far more visible was unfolding on the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. Because our next story involves a disaster so bizarre and so destructive that it reads like something out of a dark comedy. Except 21 people died, and an entire neighborhood was destroyed by a 25-foot wave of something you'd never expect to be deadly. The Great Molasses Flood was about to turn one of America's busiest industrial districts into a sticky, sweet death trap. There's something almost absurd about the idea of being killed by molasses. It's sticky, it's sweet, it moves slowly, hence the expression slow as molasses. But what if I told you that on January the 15th, 1919, molasses moved fast enough to outrun a person, hit with the force of a freight train, and created one of the most bizarre industrial disasters in American history? Picture this scene. It's a relatively warm winter afternoon in Boston's North End. Children are playing in the streets, workers are going about their daily routines, and suddenly, without warning, a 25-foot tall wave of molasses comes roaring through the neighborhood at 35 miles per hour, destroying everything in its path and trapping victims in a sticky, suffocating nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. 21 people died that day, 150 were injured, and an entire community learned that sometimes the most innocent-seeming substances can become instruments of death when corporate negligence meets the laws of physics. But here's what makes this disaster truly criminal. It was completely preventable, and the company responsible knew it was going to happen. Let me take you back to that fateful Wednesday afternoon in Boston's bustling North End, a neighborhood packed with Italian immigrants, Irish dock workers, and the kind of industrial activity that made early 20th century America an economic powerhouse. The centerpiece of this industrial landscape was a massive steel tank owned by the Piracy Distilling Company, standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. According to the detailed engineering analysis conducted by Professor Calvin Coolidge Jr., yes, related to the future president, and documented in the Boston Globe archives, this tank held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses destined to be converted into ethyl alcohol for munitions production. The tank had been hastily constructed in 1915 to meet the enormous demand for industrial alcohol during World War I. But according to the court records from the subsequent lawsuits, housed in the Massachusetts State Archives, the tank was a disaster waiting to happen from the moment it was built. Piracy Distilling had hired Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with no engineering background, to oversee the tank's construction. Gell, according to testimony recorded in The Great Molasses Flood by Stephen Paleo, made a series of cost-cutting decisions that would prove catastrophic. The steel used was half the thickness recommended by structural engineers. The rivets were improperly installed. Most damning of all, the tank was never properly tested before being filled with molasses. When local residents complained about strange creaking sounds and reported that the tank was leaking molasses so badly that children would bring cups to collect the drippings, company officials simply painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Let me repeat that. Instead of fixing the structural problems, they painted over them. For nearly 4 years, this massive time bomb sat in the middle of a densely populated neighbourhood, steadily weakening as the enormous weight of molasses pushed against steel walls that were never designed to contain it. On the morning of January the 15th, 1919, the temperature in Boston had risen unusually high for a winter day, reaching nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. According to the meteorological records kept by the US Weather Bureau and analysed by physicist Dr. Ronald Mayville in his study, The Science of the Great Molasses Flood, this temperature increase caused the molasses to expand and put additional pressure on the already compromised tank walls. At approximately 12:30 p.m, workers near the tank reported hearing a sound like machine gun fire as the rivets began failing one by one. But before anyone could react or evacuate the area, the entire tank exploded. Witness George Leard, whose testimony is preserved in the court records, described the scene. There was a dull, muffled roar, like the sound of a subway train, and then this black wall of molasses just swept everything away. The physics of what happened next are almost unbelievable. When 2.3 million gallons of molasses are suddenly released from a 50-foot height, they create what engineers call a gravity wave, essentially a tsunami of sticky liquid moving at incredible speed. According to the calculations performed by Harvard engineering professor Synod Crocker and documented in the Journal of Applied Physics, the initial wave reached heights of 25 feet and moved at approximately 35 miles per hour, fast enough that people had no time to escape and powerful enough to snap steel girders like twigs. The molasses wave lifted a section of the nearby elevated railway clean off its supports. It crushed buildings, overturned automobiles, and created a sticky brown flood that spread over 2 city blocks. But perhaps most horrifically, it trapped people in a substance that became increasingly difficult to escape as it cooled and thickened. Martin Cloquety, a 10-year-old boy who was walking home from school, was swept up by the wave and found hours later suffocated by molasses that had hardened around him like amber. His death, along with 20 others, would haunt the North End community for generations. Rescue efforts were hampered by the bizarre nature of the disaster. According to reports from the Boston Fire Department archives, firefighters found that their normal equipment was useless against the molasses, which clung to everything it touched and made movement nearly impossible. Harbour water had to be pumped in to thin the molasses enough for rescue workers to reach victims. Even then, the cleanup took weeks, and according to local newspaper reports, the smell of molasses lingered in the North End for decades afterward. But here's where this story transforms from a freak accident into a criminal case. The evidence of corporate negligence was overwhelming, and the company's attempts to cover up their responsibility were almost as outrageous as the disaster itself. Initially, Purity Distilling attempted to blame the explosion on anarchist saboteurs. Company officials claimed without any evidence that Italian immigrants had planted bombs in the tank as part of a terrorist plot. This accusation, documented in the Boston Herald coverage from January 16, 1919, was not only false, but also a deliberate attempt to shift blame away from the company's own negligence and onto an already marginalized immigrant community. The subsequent legal investigation, one of the first major class action lawsuits in American history, revealed the full extent of the company's criminal negligence. According to the final court ruling preserved in the Massachusetts legal archives, the evidence showed that Purity Distilling had ignored repeated warnings about the tank's structural integrity from their own employees, failed to conduct any safety tests before filling the tank with millions of gallons of molasses, dismissed complaints from local residents about leaks and structural problems, made cost-cutting decisions that prioritized profits over public safety, falsely blamed immigrants for a disaster they knew was caused by their own negligence. The legal battle lasted 6 years and established important precedents for corporate responsibility in industrial disasters. Judge Hugh Ogden's final ruling, according to legal historian Dr. Janet Barber's analysis in Corporate Crime in Industrial America, awarded damages of nearly $1 million to the victims' families, equivalent to about $15 million a day. More importantly, the case established that corporations could be held legally responsible for disasters caused by negligent construction and maintenance of industrial facilities, even if no specific laws have been broken. But the real crime here goes beyond corporate negligence. It's the crime of prioritizing profits over human life, of cutting corners on safety measures, and of attempting to blame the victims and their community for a disaster that was entirely preventable. The Great Molasses Flood serves as a perfect example of how industrial progress without proper safety oversight can turn everyday substances into instruments of death. It's a reminder that the most dangerous disasters are often the ones we never see coming because they involve things we consider harmless. Have you ever worked for a company that prioritized profits over safety? Have you seen situations where obvious problems were ignored because fixing them would be expensive or inconvenient? The molasses flood shows us what can happen when those attitudes are taken to their logical extreme. The victims of the molasses flood were overwhelmingly working-class immigrants who had no political power to demand safer industrial practices in their neighborhood. Their deaths were essentially sacrificed for the convenience and profits of a company that could afford to build properly but chose not to. In many ways, this disaster was a preview of the environmental and safety battles that would define much of the 20th century. The ongoing struggle between corporate profits and public safety, between efficiency and responsibility, between those who have the power to make decisions and those who bear the consequences of those decisions. But as tragic as the molasses flood was, our next story takes us into territory that's even more unsettling because it involves not corporate negligence, but academic fraud on a scale so massive that it literally stole centuries from human history. What if everything you thought you knew about the Dark Ages was a lie? What if 297 years of European history, including the reign of Charlemagne, never actually happened? Our next tale involves a conspiracy theory so elaborate and so meticulously argued that it has divided historians and raised profound questions about how we verify the truth of our own past. Here's a question that might keep you awake tonight. What if we're not actually living in the 21st century? What if the year isn't really 25 but 1728? What if nearly 3 centuries of human history, including the reign of Charlemagne, the Viking conquests, and much of what we call the Dark Ages, never actually happened at all, but were invented by a conspiracy involving the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Byzantine Emperor to justify their political power? This isn't the plot of a Dan Brown novel or some fringe internet theory. This is the phantom time hypothesis, proposed by German historian Dr. Heribert Illig in 1991, and supported by enough circumstantial evidence that it has divided academic historians and sparked one of the most fascinating debates about the nature of historical truth in modern scholarship. According to Illig's theory, documented extensively in his book Das erfundene Mittelalter, The Invented Middle Ages, The years 614 to 911 CE simply never existed. They were fabricated by medieval authorities who wanted to position themselves at significant calendar milestones. Specifically, they wanted to be ruling at the turn of the first millennium, 1000 CE, for reasons of political and religious prestige. If Illig is correct, then one of the greatest crimes in human history wasn't a murder or a theft. It was the systematic falsification of nearly 3 centuries of our collective past. But here's what makes this theory so unsettling. When you start looking at the evidence Illig presents, some of it is genuinely difficult to explain away. Let me walk you through the argument that has made otherwise rational historians question everything they thought they knew about medieval Europe. The conspiracy allegedly began with Pope Sylvester II, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII in the late 10th century. According to Illig's research, published in the Journal for Interdisciplinary Research, and extensively cited by Dr. Hans Ulrich Niemitz in Did the Early Middle Ages Really Exist?, these 3 leaders had a powerful motive to manipulate the calendar. They wanted to rule during the symbolically important year 1000 CE, marking the first millennium since Christ's birth. But according to the actual chronology, they were ruling in the early 700 CE. So they allegedly invented nearly 300 years of history and inserted them into the historical record, then adjusted the calendar to place themselves at exactly 1000 CE. The method they supposedly used was ingenious in its simplicity. They created fictional documents, forged royal chronicles, and invented entire dynasties to fill the gap between their actual time period and where they wanted to be chronologically. And here's the most disturbing part of Illig's argument. He claims that much of our evidence for early medieval history comes from documents that were discovered or copied during exactly the time period when this alleged forgery was taking place. Consider the case of Charlemagne, one of the most famous figures in European history. According to traditional chronology, Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814 CE and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800 CE. His reign is considered pivotal in European development, marking the Carolingian Renaissance and the foundation of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. But Illig argues in his analysis published by the German Archaeological Institute that there's surprisingly little contemporary archaeological evidence for Charlemagne's existence. Most of what we know about Charlemagne comes from documents written centuries after his supposed death, during exactly the period when Illig claims the historical forgery was taking place. The famous Vita Caroli Magni, Life of Charlemagne, by Bernhard, supposedly written around 830 CE, survives only in manuscripts that date to the 11th century or later. The Annals of the Kingdom of the Franks, our primary source for Carolingian history, exist only in copies made during the 10th and 11th centuries. According to Dr. Gunnar Heinsson's archaeological analysis, referenced in Illig's work, excavations of sites associated with Charlemagne have revealed significant gaps in the archaeological record that correspond exactly to the period Illig claims was invented. The palace at Aachen, supposedly Charlemagne's primary residence, shows a puzzling lack of artifacts and construction evidence from the early 9th century. Archaeological layers that should contain evidence of Carolingian occupation are either missing or contain artifacts that date to earlier or later periods. But the evidence goes beyond just Charlemagne. Illig points to a systematic lack of architectural and archaeological evidence for much of the period between 614 and 911 CE across Western Europe. The construction techniques used in buildings that supposedly date to the 8th and 9th centuries are virtually identical to those used in the 7th and 10th centuries, with none of the gradual technological evolution that archaeologists would expect to see over a 300-year period. According to Dr. Christian Bluss's architectural analysis cited in Illig's research, many buildings that are officially dated to the Phantom period show construction techniques that appear to jump directly from 7th century methods to 10th century innovations, with no intermediate developmental stages. Even more intriguingly, Illig argues that astronomical evidence supports his theory. The dating of historical solar eclipses, when calculated backward using modern astronomical software, doesn't match the dates recorded in supposedly contemporary chronicles from the 8th and 9th centuries. Dr. Klaus Weisgerber's study, published in Astronomie und Raumfahrt, found that eclipses described in Carolingian texts occurred approximately 300 years earlier than the dates given in the historical record, which would be consistent with the phantom time hypothesis. The Islamic calendar presents another puzzle. According to Illig's collaboration with Arabic historian Dr. Christoph Marx, documented in Orient und Occident, there are significant discrepancies between Islamic and Christian dating systems that would be resolved if 297 years were removed from the Christian calendar. But perhaps the most compelling argument Illig makes involves the transition from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in 1582. Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar because the Julian calendar had accumulated an error of approximately 10 days relative to the solar year. According to the standard calculation, this 10-day error should have accumulated over approximately 100 years since the Julian calendar was established. But Illig argues that if 297 years were phantom, the error would have accumulated over only 300 years, which corresponds much more precisely to the actual error that Pope Gregory corrected. However, the mainstream historical community has raised significant objections to Illig's theory, and these objections are substantial. Professor Timothy Reuter of Oxford University, writing in Medieval Worlds, points out that the phantom time hypothesis would require an impossibly vast conspiracy involving not just European authorities, but also Islamic, Byzantine, and Chinese historians, all of whom would have had to coordinate their falsification of historical records. Archaeological evidence from outside Europe contradicts the theory. Chinese astronomical records, which were kept independently of European sources, describe events that correspond to the supposedly phantom years in European history. The Islamic world maintained detailed historical records throughout the period in question, and these records include numerous interactions with European figures who supposedly never existed. Dr. André de Halleux's analysis of Byzantine sources, published in Byzantian, demonstrates that Eastern Orthodox records, which were often hostile to Western European authority, nevertheless confirm the existence of many supposedly phantom historical figures and events. But here's what makes the phantom time hypothesis so psychologically compelling, even if it's probably wrong. It forces us to confront how much of our understanding of history depends on trust rather than direct evidence. How do you personally verify that Charlemagne existed? You probably can't. You take it on faith that historians have done their due diligence, that the evidence has been properly examined, and that the scholarly consensus reflects reality rather than shared delusion. The phantom time hypothesis, whether true or false, reveals how vulnerable our understanding of the past really is. It shows how easy it would be for determined authorities to falsify historical records, especially in periods when literacy was limited and documentation was sparse. Think about it. In our digital age, with cameras everywhere and multiple independent sources recording every major event, it would be almost impossible to fake 3 centuries of history. But in the medieval period, when most people couldn't read, when documents were controlled by the religious and political authorities, and when communication between distant regions was limited, such a conspiracy might actually have been feasible. Have you ever questioned something that everyone knows to be true? Have you found yourself wondering whether widely accepted facts might actually be based on flimsy evidence that no one bothers to examine because the consensus seems so solid? The phantom time hypothesis reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a narrative constructed from evidence that can be incomplete, biased, or even deliberately falsified. Whether or not Illig is correct about the specific claim that 297 years were invented, his work serves as a valuable reminder that we should approach all historical claims with healthy skepticism and demand rigorous evidence. The real crime here might not be the alleged forgery of medieval history, but our tendency to accept historical narratives without questioning the evidence on which they're based. In a world where misinformation spreads rapidly, and where authorities regularly attempt to control historical narrative for political purposes, the phantom time hypothesis serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking and independent verification. But speaking of mysterious phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, let me tell you about something that happened in 1962 that makes the phantom time hypothesis look absolutely rational by comparison. Because our next story involves an entire country being shut down by something that spread faster than any virus, couldn't be stopped by any medicine, and left doctors completely baffled about how to treat patients who were literally dying from laughter. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic is about to begin, and by the time you hear what happened, you'll understand why sometimes the most contagious things aren't germs or ideas, but emotions that spiral completely out of control. Imagine if I told you that laughter, the most innocent human expression, the sound of joy and happiness, once became so dangerous that it shut down an entire country's education system, paralyzed communities for months, and left medical professionals completely helpless as they watched thousands of people laugh themselves into exhaustion, unable to stop even when their lives depended on it. On January 30th, 1962, in a small village school in Kashasha, Tanganyika, now Tanzania, something began that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the power of collective human behavior. It started with 3 schoolgirls who began laughing during class and couldn't stop. Within hours, the laughter had spread to dozens of students. Within days, it had infected entire communities. Within months, it had become so widespread that the government was forced to close schools across the country. This wasn't a joke that got out of hand or a prank that went too far. This was a genuine medical emergency that doctors couldn't treat, authorities couldn't control, and scientists still struggle to fully explain. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic, as it came to be known, represents one of the most bizarre cases of mass psychogenic illness in recorded history, and one of the most unsettling examples of how quickly human behavior can spiral beyond all rational control. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The laughter wasn't joyful. According to every witness account, the victims were clearly distressed, exhausted, and desperate to stop laughing, but they simply couldn't control themselves. Let me take you back to that morning in Kashasha, a small mission school run by British colonial authorities in what was then British-administered Tanganyika, just months after the country had gained independence from Britain. The school served local Kikuyu girls between the ages of 12 and 18, and according to the detailed medical reports compiled by Dr. A.M. Rankin and Dr. P.J. Phillip, published in the Central African Journal of Medicine, everything seemed perfectly normal until approximately 9:30 a.m. That's when 3 students in the same classroom suddenly began laughing uncontrollably. According to the testimony of their teacher, recorded in the official government investigation led by Dr. Christian F. Hempelman, the girls appeared to be responding to something amusing, but when questioned, they couldn't explain what had triggered their laughter. Within minutes, the laughter had spread to other students in the classroom. But this wasn't the kind of contagious giggling you might see when children find something genuinely funny. According to the medical documentation, the laughter was forced, unnatural, and accompanied by signs of distress. The affected students couldn't stop laughing even when they wanted to. They showed signs of physical exhaustion but continued laughing regardless. Most disturbing of all, the laughter seemed to spread through some kind of psychological contagion that no one understood. By noon, 95 students out of the school's total enrollment of 189 were affected. The school was forced to close and send the students home, hoping that removing them from the environment would break the cycle. It didn't. Instead, the students carried the laughter epidemic back to their home villages, where it began spreading to family members, neighbours, and anyone who came into close contact with the affected individuals. Dr. Rankin's epidemiological study, published in the British Medical Journal in 1963, tracked the spread of the epidemic with the same precision typically used for infectious diseases. According to his data, the laughter epidemic spread to 14 schools and affected over 1,000 people across a region spanning hundreds of square miles. The symptoms were remarkably consistent across all cases. Victims would begin with uncontrollable laughter that could last anywhere from a few hours to several days. This was often accompanied by crying, screaming, or other emotional outbursts. Many victims reported feeling dizzy, nauseous, or physically exhausted, but they remained unable to control their behaviour. According to Dr. Phillips' clinical observations documented in the East African Medical Journal, some victims also experienced what appeared to be temporary paralysis, fainting spells, and in severe cases, complete mental confusion. But perhaps most unsettling was the age and demographic pattern of the epidemic. According to the statistical analysis performed by medical anthropologist Robert Bartholomew, whose research is documented in Outbreak, the Encyclopedia of Extraordinary Social Behaviour, the epidemic almost exclusively affected adolescent girls and young women between the ages of 12 and 25. Adult men were virtually immune to the contagion, and adult women were affected at much lower rates. This demographic pattern suggested that the epidemic wasn't caused by an infectious agent or environmental toxin, but by some kind of psychological mechanism that specifically targeted a vulnerable population. The colonial government's response was initially dismissive. According to archived correspondence from the British Colonial Office, housed in the National Archives in London, officials initially assumed the epidemic was either mass hysteria, triggered by the stress of independence, or some kind of organised rebellion disguised as a medical condition. But as the epidemic continued to spread and schools across the region were forced to close, the severity of the situation became undeniable. The Colonial Medical Service launched a comprehensive investigation to determine whether the epidemic was caused by infectious disease, chemical contamination, or psychological factors. Dr. Rankin and his team tested water supplies, examined food sources, and conducted extensive medical examinations of affected individuals. According to their published findings, they found no evidence of infectious agents, toxins, or any other physical cause for the epidemic. Blood tests, urine samples, and neurological examinations of affected students all came back normal. There was no fever, no elevated white blood cell count, and no physical markers of any known disease. This led investigators to conclude that they were dealing with what medical professionals call mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through social contagion. But understanding the mechanism didn't make the epidemic any easier to control. Traditional medical treatments were completely ineffective. Sedatives would temporarily suppress the laughter, but victims would resume laughing as soon as the medication wore off. According to Dr. Michael Kenny's analysis, published in The Social Science of Medicine, The only intervention that showed any effectiveness was complete isolation of affected individuals from anyone who might be susceptible to the contagion. This meant separating families, closing schools, and essentially quarantining entire communities until the epidemic burned itself out. The social and economic disruption was enormous, particularly in a newly independent country that was already struggling to establish stable institutions. The epidemic finally began to subside in June 1962, approximately 6 months after it had begun. According to the final government report compiled by the Tanganyika Ministry of Health, the last recorded cases occurred in August 1962, though isolated incidents continued to be reported sporadically through 1964. But the psychological impact of the epidemic lasted much longer. According to follow-up studies conducted by Dr. Bartholomew in the 90s, many of the affected individuals continued to experience anxiety, depression, and social difficulties for years after the epidemic ended. The communities that had been most severely affected developed a kind of collective trauma around the experience. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their children's behaviour, watching for any signs that the laughter might return. Most disturbing of all, several copycat epidemics occurred in other parts of East Africa over the following years, suggesting that news coverage of the original epidemic had somehow created a template for similar outbreaks. So what actually caused the Tanganyika laughter epidemic? The honest answer is that we still don't fully know, but modern research into mass psychogenic illness has provided some compelling theories. Dr. Simon Wesley's research, published in Psychological Medicine, suggests that the epidemic was triggered by a combination of social stress, cultural factors, and the specific vulnerability of adolescent girls to peer influence and emotional contagion. The timing of the epidemic, just months after Tanganyika's independence from Britain, meant that the entire society was experiencing enormous uncertainty and change. Traditional authority structures were being challenged, educational systems were in flux, and young people were caught between traditional cultural expectations and modern aspirations. According to Dr. Bartholomew's cultural analysis, adolescent girls in this society faced particularly intense pressures around issues of education, marriage, and social expectations. The laughter epidemic may have represented a collective expression of anxiety and stress that couldn't be expressed through normal social channels. The contagion mechanism appears to have been social modelling, the unconscious imitation of behaviour observed in others. When vulnerable individuals saw their peers exhibiting symptoms, their own psychological stress manifested in the same way. Think about it. Have you ever been in a situation where one person's emotional state seemed to spread to everyone around them? Maybe a panic attack that made everyone else feel anxious, or someone's anger that escalated a whole group's mood. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic was essentially that phenomenon taken to an extreme, a case where normal social and emotional contagion spiraled completely out of control and became a genuine public health emergency. But what makes this story particularly unsettling is how it reveals the thin line between individual psychology and collective behaviour. We like to think that we're in control of our own emotions and actions, but the laughter epidemic shows how easily our behaviour can be influenced by others, especially when we're under stress or in vulnerable psychological states. The real crime in this story isn't any specific act of wrongdoing, but rather the crime against human agency itself, the way that psychological and social forces can essentially hijack our free will and force us to behave in ways that we consciously want to resist. It's a reminder that in certain circumstances, human beings can lose control not just of their actions, but of their ability to control their actions, creating a kind of psychological prison that can only be escaped through isolation or the passage of time. And if you think the idea of being trapped by uncontrollable laughter is disturbing, Wait until you hear about what happened in Kentucky in 1806, when something fell from a completely clear blue sky that challenged everything people thought they knew about the natural world. Chunks of meat, fresh, bloody, apparently recently butchered, rained down from the heavens onto a small farm, and to this day, nobody can fully explain where it came from or how it got there. The Kentucky meat shower is about to demonstrate that sometimes the most bizarre crimes against logic and reason come not from human beings, but from the universe itself. Every once in a while, the universe serves up a mystery so completely bizarre that it makes you question whether reality itself is playing some kind of cosmic joke on humanity. What I'm about to tell you happened on March 3rd, 1806 in Bath County, Kentucky, and it involved something that should be physically impossible. Fresh meat falling from a completely clear blue sky. Mrs. Rebecca Crouch was in her yard making soap when chunks of what appeared to be freshly butchered meat began raining down around her. The pieces ranged in size from tiny fragments to slabs as large as 4 inches square. They covered an area roughly 100 yards long and 50 yards wide. And here's the part that still keeps scientists awake at night. The sky was completely clear. No clouds, no storms, no aircraft. Nothing that could explain where this meat was coming from. This wasn't some tall tale passed down through generations, or a story that grew more elaborate with each telling. This was witnessed by multiple people, investigated by scientists, and reported in newspapers across the country. The Kentucky meat shower became one of America's most documented unexplained phenomena, and despite nearly 50 years of investigation, we still have no definitive explanation for what happened. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. The lengths to which people went to solve this mystery reveal as much about human nature as they do about the strange event itself. Let me paint you the complete picture of that bizarre March afternoon in Bath County. According to the detailed account published in the Louisville Commercial, on March 10th, 1876, Mrs. Rebecca Crouch was alone in her yard when the meat shower began around 11 a.m. Her husband, Alan Crouch, was working in the fields about a quarter-mile away. When she called out to him about the strange phenomenon, he initially thought she was joking. But when he arrived at the house and saw chunks of meat scattered across their property, he became one of several witnesses who would later testify to the reality of what had happened. The Crouch family immediately collected samples of the meat and preserved them for analysis. According to the report filed by Dr. A. Meade Edwards, the local physician who examined the specimens, the meat appeared to be fresh with no signs of decomposition despite having allegedly fallen from the sky. Word of the incident spread quickly through the rural community, and within days scientists and journalists from across the region were arriving in Bath County to investigate. The story was picked up by newspapers from Louisville to New York, and soon the Kentucky meat shower had become a national sensation. Dr. L.D. Castenbein, a chemistry professor from Newark College in Ohio, was among the first scientists to examine the meat samples. According to his analysis, published in the Scientific American on March 25, 1876, the specimens appeared to be a mixture of different types of animal tissue, including what looked like muscle, lung, and cartilage. But here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Several local residents, apparently driven by scientific curiosity, or perhaps just hunger, actually tasted the mysterious meat. According to the report in the New York Times from March 11, 1806, 2 men named B.F. Ellington and J.M. Lewis both sampled the meat and declared that it tasted like mutton or venison. I have to pause here and acknowledge that in 1806, food safety standards were quite different from today. The idea of eating mysterious meat that had fallen from the sky seems insane by modern standards, but apparently these gentlemen were willing to risk their lives for science. Dr. Edwards sent additional samples to Dr. J.W.S. Arnold at the Medical College of Louisville for more detailed analysis. According to Dr. Arnold's findings, published in the Louisville Medical News, the tissue samples showed characteristics of lung tissue from a horse or possibly a human infant, a conclusion that only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The most comprehensive scientific analysis was conducted by Dr. Alan McLean Hamilton, a prominent New York neurologist who had samples sent to him for examination. According to his report, documented in the Archives of Science and later referenced by Dr. William R. Corliss in Handbook of Unusual Natural Phenomena, the meat appeared to be lung tissue from a large mammal, possibly a horse. But this scientific analysis only raised more questions. How does lung tissue from a horse end up falling from a clear sky in rural Kentucky? And why was it mixed with what appeared to be muscle and cartilage from potentially different animals? Several theories emerged to explain the phenomenon, and each one was more bizarre than the last. The most popular theory, proposed by Dr. L.D. Kastenbein and later supported by several other scientists, was that the meat had been vomited by a flock of vultures flying overhead. According to this explanation, published in Scientific American, vultures have a habit of disgorging their stomach contents when startled or when they need to lighten their load for flight. But this theory had significant problems. First, multiple witnesses insisted that the sky was completely clear and that no birds were visible. Second, the amount of meat that fell was enormous, far more than could reasonably be explained by a few vultures emptying their stomachs. Professor Lawrence Smith of the University of Kentucky proposed an alternative theory involving what he called atmospheric disturbances. According to his hypothesis, documented in the American Journal of Science, tornadic winds might have picked up meat from a distant location and deposited it in Bath County, but this theory also had flaws. There were no reports of severe weather in the region, and the meat appeared to be fresh rather than having the appearance of material that had been carried long distances by wind. The most exotic theory was proposed by Dr. Robert Peter, a chemistry professor at the University of Kentucky, who suggested that the meat might have been the result of spontaneous generation, the idea that organic matter could spontaneously appear under certain atmospheric conditions. This theory, while scientifically ridiculous by the modern standards, was taken seriously by some researchers in the 1870s before we fully understood the biological impossibility of spontaneous generation. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Kentucky meat shower investigation was how it revealed the limitations of 19th century scientific methods. The researchers had samples of mysterious biological tissue, but they lacked the sophisticated analytical tools that would allow them to definitively identify the source and origin of the material. Modern forensic techniques, DNA analysis, isotope studies, chemical fingerprinting, could potentially solve the mystery in a matter of days. But in 1876, scientists were limited to visual examination, basic chemical tests, and their own best guesses about what they were observing. The story of the Kentucky meat shower also illustrates something fascinating about how unusual events become part of folklore and collective memory. According to historian Dr. Chad Lewis, author of The Kentucky Meat Shower, Scientific Mystery or Tall Tale, the incident was documented with unusual thoroughness for a 19th century rural event. Multiple newspapers carried detailed accounts. Scientists from several institutions conducted formal investigations. Samples were preserved and analysed using the best available techniques. Yet despite all this documentation, the mystery remained unsolved, and over time, the story took on almost mythical proportions. The incident became part of Kentucky folklore, passed down through generations and embellished with each telling. Some versions of the story claimed that the meat fell over a much larger area. Others suggested that it continued falling for hours rather than minutes. A few claimed that the meat was still warm when it hit the ground. These embellishments make it difficult to separate fact from fiction when examining historical accounts of the event. But the core elements of the story, meat falling from a clear sky, witnessed by multiple people and investigated by scientists, appear to be well documented historical world. So what really happened in Bath County on March 3rd, 1876? The honest answer is that we still don't know for certain, but modern research has provided some more plausible explanations. To William R. Corliss, in his extensive analysis of unusual natural phenomena, suggests that the vulture vomit theory remains the most likely explanation, despite its problems. He argues that witnesses might have failed to notice vultures flying at high altitude, and that the amount of meat could be explained by a larger flock than initially assumed. Meteorologist Dr. James MacDonald has proposed that the meat might have been carried by a microburst, a localized downdraft that can transport material over considerable distances without creating visible atmospheric disturbances. But perhaps the most interesting modern theory comes from Dr. Stephen Wagner, who has studied similar phenomena worldwide. According to his research, documented in 14 studies, there have been dozens of reported cases of organic material falling from clear skies throughout history. Most of these cases involve fish or frogs, which can be more easily explained by waterspouts or unusual weather patterns. But a few involve mammalian tissue under circumstances similar to the Kentucky incident. Dr. Wagner suggests that we may be dealing with a rare but recurring natural phenomenon that we don't yet fully understand, possibly involving atmospheric vortices that can transport biological material under very specific conditions. Have you ever experienced something so unusual that you questioned your own perception of reality? Something that seemed impossible but that you couldn't explain away? The Kentucky meat shower reminds us that the natural world still holds mysteries that can challenge our understanding of what's possible. It also shows us how the limitations of our knowledge and technology can leave us struggling to explain events that might have simple explanations if we only knew where to look. But what's perhaps most remarkable about this story is how it demonstrates the human drive to solve mysteries, even when the evidence is incomplete and the explanations seem inadequate. The scientists who investigated the meat shower were working with primitive tools and limited knowledge, but they approached the mystery with genuine curiosity and rigorous methodology. Their inability to solve the mystery doesn't diminish their efforts. It simply reminds us that some questions take longer to answer than others, and some mysteries might remain unsolved until we develop better tools for understanding the world around us. But while investigators in 1876 were puzzling over meat falling from the sky, our next story involves a medical mystery that's even more disturbing because it strikes at the very heart of what we consider free will and personal responsibility. What happens when your own hand becomes your enemy? When part of your body begins acting independently, committing actions that you consciously oppose? We're about to explore the terrifying world of alien hand syndrome, where the line between voluntary and involuntary action becomes so blurred that the legal system itself doesn't know how to respond. What if your own hand turned against you? Not metaphorically, but literally. What if one of your hands developed its own agenda, its own will, and began acting completely independently of your conscious mind? What if it started reaching for things you didn't want to touch, striking people you had no intention of hitting, or even attempting to harm you while you watched in helpless horror? This isn't science fiction or psychological thriller territory. This is a real neurological condition called alien hand syndrome, and it raises some of the most disturbing questions imaginable about free will, criminal responsibility, and the nature of consciousness itself. Patients with alien hand syndrome describe the terrifying experience of watching their own hand perform complex, purposeful actions that they neither initiated nor can control. Even more unsettling, the affected hand often seems to act with intelligence and intention, as if it's being controlled by a separate consciousness that happens to share the same body. But here's where this medical oddity becomes a criminal justice nightmare. What happens when an alien hand commits a crime? Who is legally responsible when someone's body betrays them so completely that they become a victim of their own limbs? The cases I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about personal responsibility, the nature of criminal intent, and the terrifying ways that the human brain can malfunction. Let me introduce you to one of the most documented and disturbing cases in medical literature. In 1995, Dr. Rachelle Doody and her colleagues at Baylor College of Medicine published a case study in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry and Clinical Neurosciences about a 7-year-old woman who developed alien hand syndrome following a stroke that damaged the connection between the two hemispheres of her brain. According to Dr. Doody's detailed documentation, the patient's left hand began acting completely independently shortly after her stroke. But this wasn't simple involuntary movement or random twitching. The hand displayed what appeared to be complex, goal-directed behavior that directly contradicted the patient's conscious intentions. The woman would reach for a cup of coffee with her right hand, only to have her left hand simultaneously reach out and knock the cup away. When she tried to button her shirt with her right hand, her left hand would immediately begin unbuttoning it. Most disturbing of all, the left hand would sometimes grab objects and throw them, apparently trying to hit people nearby, including the patient's own family members. The patient was fully conscious and mentally alert throughout these episodes. She could see what her hand was doing, she was horrified by its behavior, and she desperately wanted it to stop, but she had absolutely no control over its actions. According to Dr. Doody's clinical notes, the patient would often use her right hand to physically restrain her left hand, holding it down or sitting on it to prevent it from acting out. She described feeling like a prisoner in her own body, watching helplessly as part of herself behaved in ways that violated her personal values and endangered the people around her. But this case, disturbing as it was, remained within the controlled environment of a medical facility. What happens when alien hand syndrome occurs in the real world, where the consequences of involuntary actions can be far more serious? In 2000, neurologist Dr. Sergio Della Sala published a case study in Neurocase that described a 55-year-old man whose alien hand had developed what could only be described as aggressive and potentially criminal tendencies. The patient, identified only as patient GC in the medical literature, had suffered a brain tumour that required surgical removal of tissue from his frontal lobe. Following the surgery, his left hand began exhibiting behaviour that was not just independent, but actively hostile. According to Dr. Della Sala's documentation, patient GC's alien hand would reach out and grab strangers without warning. It would snatch food from other people's plates in restaurants. Most concerning of all, it would sometimes make grasping motions toward people's necks, as if attempting to strangle them. The patient was completely aware of these actions and was deeply distressed by them. He would apologize profusely to anyone his hand had grabbed or threatened, explaining that he had no control over its behavior. But according to the medical team's observations, these explanations often met with skepticism from people who couldn't believe that someone could be unaware of their own actions. This case raised profound legal and ethical questions that the medical team was forced to address. According to Dr. Della Sala's report, hospital security had to be consulted about whether the patient posed a danger to staff and other patients. The legal department was asked to research whether the hospital could be held liable if the patient's alien hand injured someone. But perhaps most troubling of all, the patient himself began to worry about his potential legal responsibility for actions committed by his alien hand. He asked the medical team repeatedly whether he could be arrested if his hand hurt someone, and whether he would be considered legally competent to make decisions about his own care, given that part of his body was acting independently. These questions led Dr. Della Sala and his colleagues to consult with legal experts, ethicists, and forensic psychiatrists about the implications of alien hand syndrome for criminal responsibility. According to their published analysis, the condition creates a unique situation where the traditional legal concept of mens rea, criminal intent, becomes almost impossible to apply. How do you determine criminal intent when the person's conscious mind is horrified by their actions, but their body continues to act independently? How do you assess competency and responsibility when someone is simultaneously the perpetrator and the victim of their own behavior? The legal implications became even more complex when researchers began studying the specific types of actions that alien hands tend to perform. According to Dr. Francois Benet and Dr. Marcel Messulam's research published in Neurology, alien hands don't just move randomly, they often display what appears to be sophisticated motor planning and problem-solving abilities. Alien hands have been observed opening complex locks, manipulating tools with skill, and even writing coherent words or phrases, all without any conscious direction from the patient. This suggests that the alien hand has access to learned motor skills and memories, making its actions appear even more intentional and deliberate. In one particularly unsettling case documented by Dr. Kurt Goldstein in his landmark study The Organism, a patient's alien hand would repeatedly attempt to perform tasks that the patient's conscious mind found morally objectionable. The hand would reach for alcohol despite the patient's commitment to sobriety, attempt to touch people inappropriately despite the patient's strict personal boundaries, and even try to harm the patient himself during moments of distress. This case raised disturbing questions about whether alien hands might be acting on suppressed desires or impulses that the conscious mind normally keeps in check. Some researchers have suggested that alien hand syndrome might represent a kind of neurological breakdown of the normal inhibitory mechanisms that prevent us from acting on every impulse we experience. Dr. Joseph Bogan, one of the pioneering researchers in split brain studies, proposed in his work The Other Side of the Brain that alien hands might be controlled by the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain, which normally plays a supporting role in motor control, but can become independent when the connection between hemispheres is severed. This theory suggests that we all have the potential for alien hand behavior, that there's a part of our brain that's constantly generating motor impulses that are normally overridden by our conscious mind. Alien hand syndrome might simply be what happens when those normal override mechanisms fail. The forensic implications of this theory are staggering. If alien hands are acting on genuine brain-generated impulses, then the actions they perform might represent authentic desires or intentions that the conscious mind simply doesn't acknowledge. This has led to what Dr. Vilayana Ramachandran calls the criminal responsibility paradox in his book Phantoms in the Brain. How do we assign blame when the crime was committed by a part of the person that they don't consciously control, but which might still represent some aspect of their genuine psychological state? These questions have practical implications because alien hand syndrome, while rare, is not as uncommon as you might think. According to the research compiled by Dr. Saeed Karazian in Neurological Rehabilitation, the condition affects approximately 1 in 2,000 stroke patients and can also result from brain tumours, neurosurgical procedures, and certain degenerative brain diseases. This means that courts, law enforcement agencies, and legal professionals need to be prepared to deal with cases where defendants claim that their criminal actions were the result of neurological conditions beyond their control. Have you ever done something and immediately thought, "I can't believe I just did that"? Have you ever felt like you were watching yourself make a decision that you knew was wrong but couldn't seem to stop yourself? Most of us have experienced moments where we feel disconnected from our own actions, but for people with alien hand syndrome, this feeling is literal and constant. They live with the terrifying knowledge that their own body can betray them at any moment, acting in ways that violate their values, endanger their relationships, and potentially even result in criminal charges. The condition also forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the nature of free will and personal responsibility. If a neurological condition can cause someone to perform complex, seemingly intentional actions without conscious control, what does that say about the actions that the rest of us perform every day? How much of our behavior is truly under our conscious control, and how much is the result of neurological processes that we don't understand and can't directly influence? These questions become even more unsettling when we consider that many criminal behaviors, impulsivity, poor decision-making, inability to consider consequences, can also be linked to specific patterns of brain dysfunction. The line between neurological condition and criminal responsibility is often much blurrier than our legal system acknowledges. Alien hand syndrome represents an extreme example of how brain dysfunction can manifest as apparently intentional behavior, but it may also be a window into understanding the neurological basis of criminal behavior more broadly. The real crime in these cases might not be the actions committed by alien hands, but our society's failure to develop legal and ethical frameworks that can adequately address the complex relationship between brain function and personal responsibility. While some people struggle with hands that act independently, our next story takes us to a very different kind of disaster. One where the weapon wasn't neurological dysfunction, but simple physics combined with corporate negligence on an almost unbelievable scale. Imagine a tsunami, but instead of water, picture a 15-foot wall of beer crashing through the streets of London, demolishing buildings and drowning people in alcohol. The Great London Beer Flood of 1814 proves that sometimes the most devastating disasters come from the most unexpected sources, and that even the most innocent substances can become instruments of mass destruction when human carelessness meets the laws of physics. And the irony of death can sometimes be so dark that it borders on the absurd. Throughout history, people have died from alcohol in various tragic ways, but I can guarantee you've never heard of anyone dying quite like the victims of October 17th, 1814, when a 15-foot-tall tsunami of beer crashed through the streets of London, destroying buildings, trapping people in their homes, and literally drowning 8 people in over 38,000 gallons of porter. This wasn't a freak natural disaster or an act of terrorism. This was the result of corporate cost-cutting, industrial negligence, and the kind of bureaucratic indifference to public safety that would make the molasses flood look like a minor workplace accident. The Great London Beer Flood represents one of the most bizarre industrial disasters in history, but it also reveals something profoundly disturbing about how little value was placed on working-class lives in Industrial Revolution England. What makes this story even more tragic is that the disaster was completely preventable. The warning signs were ignored for months, and the aftermath demonstrates how the wealthy and powerful can literally get away with murder when their victims are poor and powerless. Let me take you back to the Horseshoe Brewery in the St. Giles neighbourhood of London, one of the largest beer producers in England and a cornerstone of the local economy. According to the detailed account published in the Annual Register for 1814, the brewery operated 24 hours a day, producing thousands of gallons of porter, a dark, strong beer that was hugely popular among London's working class. The heart of the operation was a massive wooden vat, known as vat number 22, that stood 22 feet high and contained 6 to 1,000 gallons of porter. According to the engineering specifications documented by brewery historian Peter Mathias in The Brewing Industry in England, this vat was one of the largest wooden structures in London, held together by iron hoops and constructed using techniques that were already considered outdated and dangerous by 1814. The vat had been showing signs of stress for months before the disaster. According to the testimony given at the subsequent coroner's inquest, documented in the Times of London archives, brewery workers had repeatedly reported that the iron hoops holding the vat together were loose, that the wooden staves were bulging outward, and that there were visible cracks in the structure. But here's where this story transforms from industrial accident to criminal negligence. The brewery management's response to these warnings was to simply tighten the hoops with a hammer and continue operations. On the morning of October 17, 1814, brewery clerk George Crick noticed that one of the iron hoops had snapped completely. According to his testimony recorded in the coroner's proceedings, he immediately reported this to his supervisor, who told him that the matter would be looked into later and that production should continue as normal. At approximately 5:30 p.m, as the evening shift was beginning their work, vat number 22 catastrophically failed. The explosion, according to witness accounts compiled by historian Judith Flanders in the Victorian city, was heard over a mile away. The massive wooden vat simply burst apart, releasing 38,000 gallons of beer in a matter of seconds, and creating a wave that stood 15 feet high at its peak. But the disaster was only beginning. The force of the beer wave was so powerful that it immediately destroyed several adjacent vats, releasing an additional 100,000 gallons of beer and other alcoholic beverages. According to the engineering analysis conducted by the Royal Society and published in Philosophical Transactions, the total volume of liquid released was approximately 500,000 gallons. The beer tsunami crashed through the brewery walls and roared into the surrounding neighbourhood with devastating force. The St Giles area was one of London's poorest districts, packed with ramshackle tenements, narrow streets, and buildings that were already structurally unsound. According to the detailed damage assessment compiled by the parish authorities, the beer wave demolished 2 entire houses, severely damaged the wall of the Tavistock Arms pub, and flooded basements and ground floors throughout a 4-block area. But the human cost was even more devastating than the property damage. The wave struck during dinner time, when families were gathered in their homes and children were playing in the streets. 8 people died that day, including 2 children who were having tea in a basement room when the beer crashed through their window, and a mother who was serving dinner to her family when the floor collapsed and she was swept away by the torrent. According to the coroner's records, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, the victims didn't die from drowning in the conventional sense. They died from what we would now call blunt force trauma and crushing injuries caused by the sheer force of the liquid wave and the debris it carried. One victim, a young woman named Eleanor Cooper, was found buried under several feet of beer-soaked debris. According to the medical examiner's report, she had survived the initial impact but had suffocated when she couldn't dig herself out of the sticky, foam-covered mess that the beer had become as it settled. The rescue efforts were hampered by the bizarre nature of the disaster. According to reports from the London Fire Brigade, their normal equipment was useless against a flood of beer. The liquid was too thick and sticky to pump effectively, and the alcoholic content made it incredibly slippery and difficult to navigate. Residents had to form human chains to pull survivors from buildings, wading through knee-deep beer that was mixed with broken wood, iron hoops, and household debris. The smell of beer was so overwhelming that many rescue workers became nauseated, and some actually became intoxicated from breathing the alcohol-saturated air. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Great London Beer Flood was what happened after the immediate emergency was over. The brewery's response to the disaster was swift and revealing. Instead of taking responsibility for the deaths and destruction, the Moose Brewery immediately launched a legal strategy designed to avoid any financial liability for the catastrophe. According to the court records from the subsequent lawsuits housed in the National Archives, the brewery argued that the disaster was an act of God, essentially a natural disaster that couldn't have been prevented and for which they bore no responsibility. This legal argument was particularly outrageous given the extensive documentation of the vat's structural problems and the repeated warnings that had been ignored. The brewery had clear evidence that their equipment was dangerous, they had been warned repeatedly that disaster was imminent, and they had chosen to continue operations anyway. But in 1814 England, the legal system was heavily biased in favour of property owners and industrial interests. According to the legal historian Dr. John Baker's analysis in an Introduction to English Legal History, there were virtually no safety regulations governing industrial operations, and the concept of corporate liability for public safety was almost non-existent. The coroner's jury, composed entirely of property-owning men who had business relationships with the brewery, ruled that the deaths were accidental and that no criminal charges should be filed. According to the official verdict recorded in the parish records, the disaster was deemed to be a visitation of God that could not have been foreseen or prevented. This verdict was reached despite extensive testimony about the structural problems with the vat, the ignored warnings from workers, and the brewery's decision to continue operations in the face of obvious danger. But the brewery's legal victory came with an unexpected cost. According to the taxation records discovered by historian Peter Clark in the English Ale House, the massive loss of beer created a serious problem for the brewery's finances, not because of the property damage or wrongful death claims, but because they owed excise taxes on all the beer that had been destroyed. The British government taxed alcoholic beverages at the point of production, which meant that the brewery was legally obligated to pay taxes on the 38,000 gallons of beer that had flooded the neighbourhood, even though none of it had been sold. In one of the most darkly ironic twists in legal history, the brewery successfully petitioned the government for a refund of the excise taxes on the beer that had killed 8 people. According to the Treasury records, they were actually reimbursed for their loss, while paying nothing to the families of the victims. This outcome perfectly illustrates the warped priorities of Industrial Revolution England, where beer was considered more valuable than human life, and where corporate interests were protected more vigorously than public safety. The Great London Beer Flood also reveals how industrial disasters can expose deep social inequalities. The victims were all working-class residents of one of London's poorest neighbourhoods. The brewery owners were wealthy industrialists with political connections and legal resources. When the disaster struck, there was no workers' compensation, no social safety net, and no system for holding corporations accountable for the consequences of their negligence. The families of the victim received no financial assistance, no public acknowledgement of their loss, and no justice for the preventable deaths of their loved ones. Have you ever noticed how industrial disasters seem to disproportionately affect working-class communities? How the people who bear the greatest risks from corporate decision-making are often the ones with the least power to demand safer conditions? The beer flood was an early example of what we now call environmental justice, the pattern where environmental hazards and industrial dangers are concentrated in communities that lack the political and economic power to protect themselves. But the story of the Great London Beer Flood also demonstrates something important about how societies learn from disasters. According to industrial historian Dr. Christine MacLeod's research in Heroes of Invention, the beer flood contributed to growing public awareness of the need for industrial safety regulations. While no immediate changes were made to protect workers or residents from similar disasters, the beer flood became part of a broader conversation about corporate responsibility that would eventually lead to factory safety laws, building codes, and workers' compensation systems. The disaster also inspired some of the earliest examples of investigative journalism about industrial safety. According to newspaper historian Dr. Simon Potter's analysis in News and the British World, several London newspapers published detailed investigations into the brewery's safety practices and the legal system's failure to hold them accountable. These investigations, while not resulting in immediate justice for the victims, helped establish a precedent for using media coverage to pressure corporations and government agencies to take safety issues more seriously. But while London was dealing with the aftermath of a beer tsunami, our next story involves a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about the reliability of historical records themselves. Imagine if someone told you that one of the most famous books in human history, a manuscript that has puzzled scholars for centuries and spawned countless theories about its origins, might actually be the most successful hoax ever perpetrated. The Voynich manuscript has been called everything from an alien text to a work of medieval alchemy, but what if it's actually the most beautiful crime against academic curiosity ever committed? Deep in the rare book collection at Yale University's Beinecke Library sits what might be either the most important medieval manuscript ever discovered or the most elaborate academic hoax in human history. The Voynich manuscript consists of 240 pages of hand-drawn illustrations and text written in a language that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. A script so unique and systematic that it has defied every attempt at translation for over a century. The manuscript depicts plants that don't exist in nature, astronomical diagrams that don't match any known star charts, and what appear to be detailed recipes for medicines or potions written in a code that no expert has ever been able to crack. It's been studied by the world's best linguists, cryptographers, and computer scientists analysed by the NSA during World War II, and subjected to every modern decoding technique imaginable. And after all of that investigation, we still have absolutely no idea what it says, who wrote it, or whether it means anything at all. But here's what makes the Voynich manuscript one of history's most intriguing potential crimes. If it is a hoax, then someone created the most sophisticated medieval forgery ever attempted, fooling scholars for centuries and raising profound questions about how we determine what's authentic in historical research. The mystery begins in 1912 when a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich claimed to have discovered the manuscript in a trunk at the Villa Mondragone near Rome. According to Voynich's own account, documented in his correspondence with the British Museum and preserved in the Wilfrid Voynich Archive, he purchased the manuscript from Jesuit priests who needed money to restore their library. But here's where the story immediately becomes suspicious. Voynich was notoriously secretive about the exact circumstances of his discovery. He provided conflicting accounts of where he found the manuscript, which priests he dealt with, and how much he paid for it. According to the manuscript historian Dr. René Zandbergen's research, published in the Voynich manuscript, an elegant enigma, many of the details in Voynich's story simply don't check out. Voynich claimed the manuscript came with a letter from Johannes Marcus Marzi, a 17th century Bohemian doctor, stating that the book had once belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II and had been written by the famous medieval philosopher Roger Bacon. But according to paleographic analysis by Dr. Mary D'Imperio, documented in the Voynich manuscript, an elegant enigma, this letter shows signs of having been artificially aged and may itself be a forgery. The manuscript itself presents even more puzzles. According to radiocarbon dating conducted by the University of Arizona and published in Radiocarbon Journal, the vellum animal skin pages date to the early 15th century, between 1404 and 1438. The ink has also been analysed and appears to be consistent with medieval materials. But here's what's so strange about those dates. They place the manuscript's creation during a period when literacy was extremely limited, scientific illustration was primitive, and the kind of systematic botanical drawing shown in the Voynich manuscript simply didn't exist. The manuscript contains over 100 detailed plant illustrations, many of which appear to be completely fictional. According to botanist Arthur Tucker's analysis, published in Herbalgram, some of the plants shown in the manuscript combine features from multiple real species in ways that suggest either artistic imagination or knowledge of plants from regions that medieval Europeans shouldn't have had access to. The astronomical sections are equally puzzling. According to astronomer Dr. Andreas Schinner's research documented in Journal for the History of Astronomy, the star charts and zodiacal diagrams don't match any known medieval astronomical traditions, European or otherwise. They appear to follow their own unique symbolic system that has no parallels in historical astronomy. But it's the text itself that presents the greatest mystery. The Voynich manuscript contains approximately 70,000 characters written in a unique script that uses about 20-25 distinct symbols. According to linguistic analysis conducted by Dr. Jorge Stolfi at the University of Campinas, the text shows statistical properties that suggest it's a real language rather than random gibberish. The text has word patterns, apparent sentence structures, and statistical regularities that are consistent with natural language. Some words appear frequently while others are rare, following what linguists call Zipf's law. The script also shows corrections, insertions, and other features that suggest the writer was actually composing meaningful text, rather than creating decorative nonsense. Yet despite these linguistic properties, no one has ever successfully translated a single word of the manuscript. According to cryptographer Dr. Klaus Schmey's comprehensive analysis in Cryptologia, the Voynich script has resisted every code-breaking technique known to modern cryptography. During World War II, the US military assigned some of their best codebreakers to study the manuscript, thinking it might contain secrets relevant to the war effort. According to declassified NSA documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, these experts, the same people who had successfully broken enemy codes, were completely stumped by the Voynich text. Modern computer analysis has yielded equally frustrating results. According to Dr. Marcelo Montemuro's research, published in PLOS 1, artificial intelligence systems trained on dozens of natural languages have been unable to identify any linguistic patterns that would allow translation of the Voynich script. This failure to decode the text has led to increasingly exotic theories about the manuscript's origins. Some researchers have suggested it might be written in an artificial language created by a medieval genius. Others have proposed it could be a form of early steganography, where the real message is hidden within seemingly meaningless text. The most dramatic theory comes from Dr. Gordon Rugg of Keele University, who has argued in Cryptologia that the entire manuscript is an elaborate hoax created using a technique called a Cardan grill, a perforated template that could be used to generate meaningless but linguistically consistent text. According to Dr. Rugg's analysis, a skilled forger could have used this technique to create text that appears to follow natural language patterns while actually containing no meaningful information. This would explain why the text has linguistic properties but resists all translation attempts. But Dr. Rugg's hoax theory faces significant challenges. According to manuscript expert Dr. Lisa Fagan-Davis's critique, published in Manuscripta, the level of consistency and sophistication required to maintain such a hoax across 240 pages would have required extraordinary skill and dedication. The forger would have needed to maintain consistent character formations, develop a systematic approach to illustration, and create text that would fool linguistic analysis even centuries later. According to Dr. Davis's analysis, this would represent a level of sophisticated forgery that was probably beyond the capabilities of medieval or early modern forgers. The authentication question becomes even more complex when we consider the manuscript's physical properties. According to conservation analysis conducted by the Voynich Library and documented in their preservation reports, the manuscript shows every sign of genuine age and medieval construction. The vellum pages are made from animal skin, prepared using medieval techniques. The ink penetrates the writing surface in ways consistent with aged manuscripts. The binding, while later in date, uses materials and methods consistent with historical bookbinding practices. Most importantly, the manuscript shows patterns of wear, staining and damage that would be extremely difficult to fake convincingly. According to conservator Paula Zayat's technical analysis, the manuscript has been handled, read, and stored in ways that leave physical traces accumulated over centuries. Yet questions about the manuscript's authenticity persist, particularly regarding Wilfrid Voynich himself. According to biographical research by Dr. Michael Barrett, documented in The Book Collector, Voynich was a master forger who had previously been involved in creating fake medieval manuscripts for the antiquarian book trade. Voynich had the knowledge, skills, and motivation to create an elaborate forgery. He understood medieval manuscript production, had access to appropriate materials, and desperately needed money to finance his rare book business. According to financial records preserved in the Voynich archive, he was deeply in debt when he discovered the manuscript. The timing of the discovery is also suspicious. According to Dr. Zandbergen's chronological analysis, Voynich announced his discovery just as the international market for medieval manuscripts was reaching its peak, with wealthy American collectors paying enormous sums for unique historical documents. But here's what makes the authentication question so fascinating. Even if the Voynich manuscript is a hoax, it would still represent an extraordinary achievement in historical forgery. The level of creativity, consistency, and attention to detail required to create such a convincing fake would itself be worthy of historical recognition. Think about it. Have you ever tried to create a secret code or invented language? Most of us can barely maintain consistency across a few pages, let alone create something sophisticated enough to fool experts for over a century. If the Voynich manuscript is a hoax, then its creator committed the perfect intellectual crime, creating something so convincing that it has generated decades of legitimate scholarly research, while revealing nothing about its true nature. The manuscript has inspired books, documentaries, academic conferences, and countless research projects. Universities have spent millions of dollars studying it. Some of the world's most brilliant minds have devoted years of their lives to trying to decode it. If it's all based on a lie, then the Voynich manuscript represents one of the most successful cons in academic history. A beautiful, meaningless object that has been elevated to the status of a profound mystery simply because we want it to contain secrets. But perhaps that's exactly what makes it so compelling. Whether the Voynich manuscript is genuine or fake, it forces us to confront our assumptions about knowledge, authenticity, and the nature of historical truth. It reminds us that some of our most cherished beliefs about the past might be based on incomplete evidence, wishful thinking, or elaborate deceptions that we're not clever enough to detect. And speaking of elaborate deceptions that challenge our understanding of historical truth, our next story involves something that happened in the skies over Siberia in 1908. An explosion so massive that it flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest was heard 1,000 kilometers away and registered on seismographs across Europe. But here's the strange part. Despite being one of the most powerful explosions in recorded history, the Tunguska event was kept secret by the Soviet government for decades, and even today, we're not entirely sure what caused it. Some say it was a meteorite, others claim it was a comet, and a few insist it was something far more extraordinary. Consider this for a moment. The most powerful explosion in recorded human history happened over a century ago, flattened an area larger than London, and was so bright that people could read newspapers by its light from 400 miles away. Yet for decades the world's governments acted as if it had never happened at all. On June 30th, 1908, at exactly 7:14 a.m. local time, something exploded in the remote Siberian wilderness with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. The blast was heard in Europe. Seismographs around the world registered the impact. The atmospheric pressure wave circled the globe twice, and for nearly 20 years, the Soviet government pretended it didn't exist. The Tunguska event represents one of the most blatant examples of governmental information suppression in modern history, but it also raises disturbing questions about what other extraordinary events might be hidden from public knowledge simply because they're too strange, too threatening, or too impossible to explain. What makes this cover-up even more remarkable is that it involved concealing something that was visible from space and recorded by scientific instruments across multiple continents. This wasn't a small incident that could be quietly buried. This was a world-changing event that required a massive coordinated effort to keep secret. Let me take you back to that summer morning in 1908, to the banks of the Podkamennaya Tunguska River in central Siberia, one of the most remote and uninhabited regions on Earth. At 7:14 a.m., local reindeer herders and the few Russian settlers in the area witnessed something that defied all understanding. According to the eyewitness accounts later collected by Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik and documented in his expedition reports, preserved in the Russian Academy of Sciences archives, witnesses described seeing a brilliant blue-white light moving across the sky, followed by a flash brighter than the sun. The explosion that followed was unlike anything in human experience. According to the testimony of Semyon Semenov, a trader who was sitting on his porch about 40 miles from the blast site, the heat was so intense that it felt like his shirt was on fire. He was knocked unconscious by the shockwave, and when he awoke, he found that the explosion had blown out all the windows in his cabin and thrown him several feet from where he'd been sitting. Chushan, an Evenk reindeer herder who was about 25 miles from the epicenter, reported that the blast killed his entire herd of reindeer and destroyed his tent. According to his account, recorded in Kulik's field notes, the forest around him simply disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of trees were flattened in an instant, pointing away from the blast site like fallen matchsticks. But here's what makes the Tunguska event so extraordinary from a scientific perspective. The explosion occurred in the air, approximately 5-10 kilometers above the ground. According to the analysis conducted by Dr. Christopher Chyber and published in Nature, this airburst created destruction patterns unlike anything caused by conventional explosions or even nuclear weapons. The blast flattened an estimated 80 million trees across an area of approximately 250 square kilometers. According to forestry surveys conducted decades later by Dr. V.G. Fast and documented in Soviet physics, the trees weren't just knocked down, they were stripped of branches and bark, creating a radial pattern of destruction that extended for dozens of miles in every direction. At the exact center of the blast, however, something strange happened. According to Kulik's expedition reports, trees at ground zero remained standing, though they were completely stripped of branches and foliage. This telegraph pole effect is consistent with an airburst that created a column of downward pressure at the epicenter while radiating outward force in all directions. the atmospheric effects of the explosion were even more remarkable. According to meteorological records from the British Meteorological Office, archived in the UK National Archives, the blast created atmospheric pressure waves that were detected by barographs across Europe. The pressure wave was so powerful that it circled the Earth twice, registering on instruments in Germany, Denmark, and even as far away as Washington, D.C. But perhaps most spectacular were the optical effects that followed the explosion. According to reports compiled by Dr. William F. Denning and published in Knowledge magazine, the blast created atmospheric disturbances that caused extraordinary aurora-like phenomena across Europe and Asia for several days after the event. People in London reported that the night sky was so bright they could read newspapers outdoors at midnight. Residents of Berlin photographed these unusual light displays, which appeared as shifting curtains of luminescence across the northern horizon. Similar phenomena were reported from Paris, Stockholm, and even as far south as the Mediterranean. These atmospheric disturbances were caused by the injection of massive amounts of dust and vapour into the upper atmosphere, creating light scattering effects that persisted for weeks after the initial explosion. According to atmospheric physicist Dr. Richard Turco's analysis, published in Scientific American, the scale of these effects suggests that the Tunguska explosion was comparable to a moderate volcanic eruption in terms of its impact on global atmospheric conditions. Given the scale and visibility of these effects, you might assume that the Tunguska event became an immediate focus of international scientific investigation. Instead, the opposite happened. The Russian government, already struggling with political upheaval that would culminate in the 1917 revolution, made no attempt to investigate the explosion. According to historical records compiled by Dr. John Baxter and Dr. Thomas Atkins in The Fire Came By, the Tsarist authorities had no resources to spare for investigating a mysterious explosion in the middle of nowhere, especially one that apparently caused no significant casualties. But the real cover-up began after the Communist Revolution, when the Soviet government actively suppressed information about the Tunguska event for reasons that remain unclear even today. The first serious scientific expedition to the Tunguska site wasn't launched until 1927, nearly 20 years after the explosion. Leonid Kulik, a scientist with the Soviet Academy of Sciences, had been lobbying the government for years to investigate what he believed was a meteorite impact of unprecedented size. According to Kulik's correspondence with Soviet authorities, preserved in the Academy archives and translated by Dr. E.L. Krinoff in Giant Meteorites, Kulik faced enormous bureaucratic resistance to his investigation plans. Soviet officials repeatedly denied him funding, transportation, and permits to visit the remote blast site. When Kulik finally received permission to mount an expedition, it was with minimal funding and strict instructions to avoid any public discussion of his findings. According to his expedition journal, Kulik was explicitly told that his research was to be classified and that any publications would require approval from state censors. What Kulik found at the blast site only deepened the mystery and intensified the government's desire for secrecy. According to his detailed field reports, the destruction was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, but there was no evidence of a meteorite impact crater. This absence of a crater was deeply puzzling because the scale of destruction clearly indicated an explosion equivalent to a massive meteorite impact. According to contemporary impact theory, such an explosion should have created a crater several kilometers wide and hundreds of meters deep. Instead, Kulik found a series of small bog holes and what appeared to be the remnants of an ancient impact crater that predated the 1908 explosion by thousands of years. The lack of fresh impact evidence led Kulik to conclude that the 1908 explosion was caused by something other than a conventional meteorite. Kulik's findings were immediately classified by the Soviet government. According to declassified documents obtained after the fall of the Soviet Union, and analysed by historian Dr. Vladimir Rubtsov in the Tunguska mystery, Soviet authorities were concerned that publicising the Tunguska event would attract unwanted international attention to their remote Siberian territories. The Soviets were also worried about the potential military implications of the explosion. According to intelligence documents preserved in the Russian state archives, some officials suspected that the Tunguska event might have been caused by experimental weapons testing by foreign powers, possibly the German Empire or the United States. This paranoia led to a systematic effort to suppress all information about Tunguska. Scientific papers were censored, expedition reports were classified, and international researchers were denied access to the blast site. According to Dr. Rubtsov's analysis, the Soviet government maintained this information blackout for over 40 years. The cover-up was so successful that most of the world forgot about the Tunguska event entirely. According to media analysis conducted by Dr. David Morrison in Cosmic Catastrophes, Western newspapers that had initially reported the strange atmospheric phenomena of 1908 never connected these events to a massive explosion in Siberia. It wasn't until the 1960s, during a brief period of Soviet scientific openness, that details about Tunguska began to emerge in international publications. Even then, much of the information remained classified, and Western scientists were still denied access to the blast site. The end of the Cold War finally opened up opportunities for international research at Tunguska, but by then, nearly a century had passed since the original explosion. According to contemporary researchers like Dr. Giuseppe Longo, who has led multiple international expeditions to the site, decades of Soviet secrecy made it much more difficult to investigate the event scientifically. Crucial evidence had been lost or contaminated. Eyewitnesses had died. The forest had regrown, obscuring much of the original damage pattern. Most importantly, the long delay in open scientific investigation had allowed conspiracy theories and speculation to fill the information vacuum. Today, theories about the Tunguska event range from the scientifically plausible to the utterly fantastic. According to Dr. Benny Peiser's survey published in Catastrophism and Evolution, proposed explanations include asteroid impacts, comet airbursts, antimatter explosions, black hole collisions, alien spacecraft crashes, and experiments by Nikola Tesla with wireless power transmission. The most widely accepted scientific explanation, supported by computer modelling conducted by Dr. Mark Boslos at Sandia National Laboratories and published in International Journal of Impact Engineering, is that Tunguska was caused by the airburst of a rocky asteroid approximately 40 or 60 meters in diameter. According to this model, the asteroid exploded in the atmosphere due to the extreme heat and pressure generated by its high-speed entry, creating a downward-directed blast wave that caused the observed destruction pattern without leaving a crater. But the lack of definitive physical evidence means that the Tunguska mystery remains unsolved, and the decades of government secrecy have made it impossible to know whether this uncertainty is due to scientific limitations or deliberate concealment of evidence. The Tunguska cover-up demonstrates how governments can successfully suppress information about even the most spectacular events when they occur in remote locations and when officials are determined to maintain secrecy. It also shows how information suppression can actually make mysteries more mysterious by preventing scientific investigation during the crucial period immediately after an event. Have you ever wondered what other extraordinary events might be hidden from public knowledge? How many times have governments decided that the public isn't ready for certain information, or that national security requires keeping amazing discoveries secret? The Tunguska event reminds us that transparency and scientific openness are essential for understanding our world. When governments prioritize secrecy over knowledge, they don't just hide information, They rob humanity of the opportunity to learn from remarkable events that could advance our understanding of natural phenomena. But while the Soviets were covering up mysterious explosions in Siberia, another kind of cover-up was unfolding in medieval Germany, one that would have consequences lasting far beyond any single explosion, no matter how powerful. Our next story involves the disappearance of 30 children from the town of Hamelin in 1284, an event so traumatic that it became embedded in European folklore as the tale of the Pied Piper. But what if this beloved fairy tale is actually preserving the memory of something far more sinister? A medieval crime that involved child trafficking, economic exploitation, or something even darker? Behind every beloved fairy tale lies a kernel of historical truth, but some of those truths are far darker than we'd like to believe. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, the mysterious musician who led 30 children out of town and into the mountains, never to be seen again, isn't just a whimsical children's story about keeping promises and paying debts. It's the folk memory of one of medieval Europe's most disturbing unsolved crimes. The mass disappearance of children from the German town of Hamelin on June 26, 1284. This wasn't a gradual emigration or a plague that claimed young lives. This was 30 children vanishing in a single day, leaving behind traumatized families and a community so devastated that they changed their calendar system and banned music in the street where the children were last seen. What makes this historical crime even more chilling is that it was recorded not as folklore, but as documented fact in official town records, church chronicles, and legal documents that survive to this day. The people of medieval Hamelin weren't telling a fairy tale, they were preserving the memory of a real catastrophe that destroyed their community. But here's what transforms this from a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister. The evidence suggests this wasn't a random tragedy, but an organized crime involving child trafficking, forced migration, or systematic exploitation of vulnerable young people by authorities who should have protected them. Let me take you back to the summer of 1284, to the prosperous market town of Hamelin in Lower Saxony, where trade was booming and the future seemed bright for families who had worked hard to build better lives for their children. The first thing you need to understand about medieval Hamelin is that it wasn't some backwater village where children could disappear without anyone noticing. According to the research conducted by historian Wolfgang Mieder, documented in the Pied Piper, a handbook, Hamelin was a significant commercial centre with a population of approximately 7,000 people. The town was prosperous enough to support multiple churches, a thriving market square, and the kind of detailed record-keeping that allows us to know exactly what happened on that terrible day in 1284. According to the original Latin inscription preserved in Hamelin's market church, and translated by Dr. W.H. Vogelweit in Mitteilungen des Vereins für Geschichte und Altertumskunde, the disappearance was recorded as follows. In the year 1284, on the day of John and Paul, June 26th, 130 children born in Hamelin were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicoloured clothes and were lost at Calvary near the hills. This inscription, carved in stone sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century, is remarkably specific about numbers, dates, and circumstances. It reads like a legal document rather than a piece of folklore, suggesting that the people who commissioned it wanted to preserve an accurate historical record rather than create an entertaining story. But the market church inscription is just one of multiple contemporary sources that document the disappearance. According to Dr. Mieder's comprehensive analysis, the event is also recorded in the town's official chronicle, known as the Hamelin Chronicle, which was maintained by the town council and local clergy. The chronicle entry, preserved in the Hamelin City Archives, provides additional details that don't appear in later folklore versions. According to the Chronicle, the children who disappear ranged in age from approximately 7 to 18 years old. They came from families across all social classes, not just the poor or marginalised, but also the children of merchants, craftsmen, and even minor nobility. Most importantly, the Chronicle makes it clear that the children left voluntarily, following the piper willingly rather than being kidnapped by force. This detail is crucial because it suggests that whoever led the children away had gained their trust and convinced them to leave their families and homes. The immediate aftermath of the disappearance was devastating for the community. According to the records compiled by local historian Dr. Heinrich Spaneth in Der Rattenfänger von Hameln, the town council immediately banned music and dancing in the street where the children were last seen, a prohibition that remained in effect for over 400 years. The town also changed its dating system, beginning to measure years not from Christ's birth or the reign of kings, but from the year of the children's disappearance. Documents from the late 13th and early 14th centuries consistently use formulations like, "in the 3rd year after the departure of the children," or 10 years since the children were led away. This suggests that the disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy for affected families, but a community-wide trauma that fundamentally altered how the people of Hamelin understood their own history and identity. But what actually happened to those 130 children? The historical evidence points to several disturbing possibilities, all of which involve systematic exploitation of young people by authorities who had both the power and the motivation to orchestrate such a crime. The most historically documented theory involves what medieval historians call colonial recruitment, or settlement migration. According to Dr. Hans Dobbertin's research published in Niedersächsisches Jahrbuch, the late 13th century was a period of intensive German colonization of territories in Eastern Europe. German nobles and religious orders were actively recruiting settlers to establish new towns and agricultural communities in regions that are now part of Poland, Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. These recruitment efforts specifically targeted young people who could be trained for specific skills and who were old enough to work but young enough to adapt to new environments. According to documented recruitment practices from this period, analysed by Dr. Charles Higunet in German Settlement in Eastern Europe, recruiters would often focus on prosperous towns like Hamelin because they produced young people with valuable skills in crafts, trades, and agriculture. The timing of the Hamelin disappearance coincides exactly with a major recruitment campaign for the establishment of new settlements in Pomerania and Prussia. According to administrative records from the Teutonic Knights, preserved in the secret state archives in Berlin, recruitment quotas for young settlers reached their peak in the 1280s. But here's what makes this recruitment theory particularly sinister. There's no evidence that the children of Hamelin or their families consented to this migration. According to medieval law, as analysed by Dr. John Fried in Nobles, Ministerials and Knights, parents had absolute authority over their children's movements and labour contracts. For 130 children to leave without parental consent would have required either massive deception or the involvement of authorities who could override parental rights, possibly local nobles, church officials or representatives of the Holy Roman Emperor who had the legal power to conscript labour for imperial projects. The second major theory involves what medieval sources euphemistically called crusade recruitment. According to Dr. Gary Dixon's research in The Children's Crusade, the late 13th century saw numerous attempts to organise youth crusades to the Holy Land. These weren't the massive military expeditions led by knights and nobles, but smaller recruitment efforts that targeted young people with promises of spiritual salvation and adventure. According to contemporary accounts, many of these crusades were actually fronts for human trafficking operations that sold young Europeans into slavery in North Africa, the Middle East. The timing again fits perfectly. According to Dr. Norman Housley's analysis in the later Crusades, 1284 was a year of intense crusading activity, with multiple expeditions being organised from German territories. But perhaps the most disturbing theory involves local economic exploitation. According to Dr. Barbara Hanwalt's research on medieval childhood, documented in Growing Up in Medieval London, the late 13th century saw increasing demand for child labour in industries like textile production, mining, and metallurgy. Children were particularly valuable because they could work in confined spaces, had small fingers suitable for detailed work, and could be paid far less than adult workers. According to guild records from this period, some industries were essentially dependent on the child labour to remain profitable. The prosperity of Hamelin meant that local children were well-fed, healthy, and likely to have basic literacy and numeracy skills that made them particularly valuable as workers. It's possible that the piper was actually a labour recruiter working for distant industrial operations that needed skilled young workers. This theory is supported by the fact that none of the children ever returned to Hamelin or sent word to their families. If they had been killed in an accident or died from disease during migration, at least some evidence would have emerged over time. The complete absence of any trace suggests that the children were deliberately isolated from their home community. The cover-up aspect of the Pied Piper case becomes clear when you examine how the story evolved over time. According to Dr. Meader's textual analysis, early accounts focus on the factual details of the disappearance, the date, the number of children, the circumstances of their departure. But as decades passed, these accounts began to include fantastical elements that obscured the original crime. The piper became a magical figure with supernatural powers. The children's disappearance became their fault for following him, rather than the fault of whoever orchestrated their removal. Most significantly, later versions of the story added the famous rat-catching prologue, which provided a seemingly rational explanation for why the town would trust a stranger with their children. According to Dr. Meader's research, this rat-catching episode doesn't appear in any source earlier than the 16th century, over 200 years after the original event. The addition of magical and fantastical elements served to transform a documented historical crime into a moral fable about keeping promises and paying debts. This transformation effectively protected whoever was responsible for the original disappearance by making the story seem too fantastic to be taken seriously as historical fact. Modern efforts to investigate the Pied Piper case have been hampered by the passage of time, but also by what appears to be deliberate destruction of evidence. According to Dr. Spanuth's archival research, many of the original documents relating to the disappearance were destroyed during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. But this destruction wasn't random, it specifically targeted records from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, exactly the period when evidence about the children's fate might have been preserved. The pattern of destruction suggests that someone wanted to ensure that the truth about the Pied Piper case would never be uncovered. The real crime of the Pied Piper case isn't just the disappearance of 30 children, but the systematic erasure of evidence about what happened to them, and the transformation of their tragedy into entertainment. Think about it. How many other historical crimes have been disguised as folklore? How many real victims have been forgotten because their suffering was turned into stories that people assumed were just imagination? The Pied Piper case reminds us that fairy tales often preserve memories of real historical trauma, but they also serve to distance us from that trauma by making it seem fantastical rather than factual. When we tell children the story of the Pied Piper, we're not just sharing a moral lesson about keeping promises, we're unknowingly perpetuating the cover-up of a medieval crime that destroyed 30 families and devastated an entire community. But while the children of Hamelin disappeared into the mists of history and folklore, Our final story involves a crime that was designed not to erase history, but to rewrite it entirely. What we're about to explore represents perhaps the most successful disinformation campaign in human history, a fabricated document that convinced millions of people to believe in a conspiracy that never existed, fueled some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, and continues to spread hatred and violence even today. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion proves that sometimes the most devastating crimes are committed not with weapons or violence, but with lies so carefully crafted that they become more convincing than the truth itself. After everything we've explored tonight, from armies defeated by emus to children dancing themselves to death, from beer tsunamis to pickled ears that started wars, I want to end our journey with perhaps the most devastating crime in our entire collection. But this final story is different from all the others, because the crime wasn't something that happened, it was something that never happened at all. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fabricated document that describes a fictional Jewish conspiracy to control the world. It was created by the Russian secret police around 1903, plagiarized from multiple earlier fictional works, and has been definitively proven to be a complete forgery. Yet this manufactured lie became one of the most influential documents in human history, inspiring pogroms, justifying genocide, and continuing to spread hatred and violence more than a century after its creation. What makes the Protocols the ultimate crime against truth is that it succeeded beyond its creator's wildest imagination. This fake document convinced millions of people to believe in a conspiracy that never existed, turning ordinary citizens into participants in some of the worst atrocities in human history. The story begins in Paris around 1897, where members of the Russian secret police known as the Okhrana were working to undermine liberal and revolutionary movements throughout Europe. According to historian de Norman Cohn's exhaustive research, documented in Warrant for Genocide, the Okhrana needed propaganda that would discredit their political enemies by associating them with a sinister international conspiracy. The man tasked with creating this propaganda was Pyotr Rachkovsky, head of the Okhrana's Paris operations. According to Dr. Richard Levy's analysis in Antisemitism, a historical encyclopedia, Rachkovsky was a master manipulator who understood that the most effective lies are those that confirm what people already want to believe. Rachkovsky's solution was brilliant in its cynical simplicity. He would create a document that appeared to be the secret minutes of meetings held by Jewish leaders planning world domination. By framing the conspiracy as Jewish, Rachkovsky could tap into centuries of anti-Semitic prejudice while deflecting attention from the real political and economic forces that were driving social change in Europe. But Rachkovsky didn't create the Protocols from scratch. According to detailed textual analysis conducted by Dr. Kesra de Michelis and published in the non-existent manuscript, the Protocols were plagiarized from at least 3 earlier fictional works. The primary source was a French political satire called Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, written by Maurice Joly in 1864 as an attack on Napoleon III. Joly's book described a fictional conspiracy to control France through manipulation of the press, finance, and political institutions. Rachkovsky's operatives simply took Joly's fictional dialogue, replaced references to Napoleon III with references to Jewish leaders, and added anti-Semitic elements borrowed from Hermann Goethe's 1868 novel Biarritz, which included a chapter about a secret Jewish meeting in a Prague cemetery. The result was a document that read like a genuine conspiracy, but was actually a patchwork of plagiarized fiction. According to Dr. Steven Zipperstein's analysis in Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tilt of History, the Protocols were so obviously fabricated that even some members of the Okhrana questioned whether anyone would believe them. They were wrong. The protocols were first published in Russia in 1903, and their impact was immediate and devastating. According to historical records compiled by Dr. Robert Weinberg in Blood Libel in late Imperial Russia, the document was used to justify the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, where 47 Jews were murdered and hundreds more injured by mobs convinced that they were striking back against a secret conspiracy. But the real global spread of the protocols began after the Russian Revolution of 1917. White Russian emigrants fleeing the Bolshevik victory carried copies of the document throughout Europe and the Americas, claiming that the Russian Revolution was proof that the Jewish conspiracy described in the protocols was real. According to Dr. Stephen Bronner's research in A Rumor About the Jews, the protocols were translated into dozens of languages and published in countries across the world. Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, serialized the protocols in America, giving the document mainstream credibility and circulation. By the mid-20s, the protocols had become one of the most widely read books in the world, outselling many legitimate historical and political works. According to publishing records analysed by Dr. Hadassah Ben-Itto in The Lie That Wouldn't Die, the document was translated into more languages and had more editions than almost any other book of the early 20th century. The success of the protocols, despite overwhelming evidence of their fraudulent nature, reveals something disturbing about human psychology and the power of confirmation bias. People wanted to believe in the conspiracy because it provided simple explanations for complex problems. Economic hardship, it was caused by Jewish bankers. Political instability, it was orchestrated by the Jewish revolutionaries. Social change, it was part of a Jewish plot to destroy traditional values. The protocols allowed people to blame a single group for all of their problems while feeling like they possessed secret knowledge that explained everything wrong with the world. The most devastating use of the protocols came in Nazi Germany, where Adolf Hitler cited the document extensively in Mein Kampf and used it to justify the systematic persecution and eventual genocide of European Jews. According to testimony at the Nuremberg trials documented in the trial of German major war criminals, Nazi officials explicitly referenced the protocols when planning and implementing the Holocaust. Julius Streicher, publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, told the Nuremberg tribunal that the protocols were proof that the extermination of Jews was necessary for German survival. Heinrich Himmler distributed copies of the protocols to SS officers as required reading. The document that began as a tool for Russian secret police to discredit their political enemies had evolved into a justification for the murder of 6 million people. Even after World War II definitively exposed the protocols as fabrications, the document continued to spread. According to Dr. Esther Webman's research in The Global Impact of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the protocols have been republished in the Middle East, translated into Arabic and Farsi, and continue to be cited by terrorist organizations and hate groups worldwide. Modern internet distribution has given the protocols a new lease on life. According to studies conducted by the Anti-Defamation League, the document is now available in digital formats in virtually every language and continues to find new audiences among people looking for explanations for global conflicts and economic inequality. What makes the continuing influence of the protocols so remarkable is that their fraudulent nature has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. In 1921, just 18 years after their initial publication, the London Times published a series of articles conclusively demonstrating that the protocols were plagiarized from Maurice Joly's 1864 satire. Court cases in Switzerland, 1935, and South Africa, 1998, examined the evidence and ruled that the protocols were obvious forgeries with no basis in fact. Academic historians, intelligence agencies, and forensic document experts have all confirmed that the protocols are fabricated. Yet none of this evidence has prevented the document from continuing to spread and influence people's beliefs about Jews and world events. The crime of the protocols isn't just that they're false, it's that they demonstrate how lies can become more powerful than truth when they appeal to people's fears and prejudices. The protocols show us that facts alone are not enough to combat disinformation, when that disinformation serves psychological and political needs. The real criminals in this story aren't just Rakovsky and his operatives who created the original forgery. The real criminals are everyone who has republished, distributed, and promoted the protocols despite knowing they're false, and everyone who has used these fabricated documents to justify hatred and violence against innocent people. Think about this. In our age of social media and instant global communication, how easy would it be for someone to create a modern version of the protocols? How quickly could a well-crafted lie spread around the world before anyone had time to fact-check it? The protocols remind us that the most dangerous weapons aren't always physical. Sometimes the most devastating attacks on human civilization come in the form of ideas, false ideas that appeal to our worst instincts and convince us that our neighbours are our enemies. And that brings us to the end of our journey through history's most bizarre crimes and peculiar human decisions. From emus defeating armies to lies that killed millions, we've seen how human behaviour can spiral into absurdity, tragedy, and evil in ways that challenge everything we think we know about logic, reason, and moral responsibility. What strikes me most about all these stories is how they reveal the thin line between civilization and chaos, between rational decision-making and collective madness, between truth and the lies we tell ourselves when the truth becomes too uncomfortable to bear. Each of these bizarre crimes teaches us something important about human nature. Our capacity for overconfidence, our vulnerability to mass hysteria, our willingness to believe convenient lies, and our tendency to prioritize short-term gains over long-term consequences. But they also reveal our capacity for resilience, investigation, and the gradual discovery of truth even when powerful forces try to suppress it. Thank you for joining me on this strange journey through the darker corners of the human history. I hope these stories have made you think differently about the past, the present, and the ways that truth and falsehood compete for space in our collective memory. The world is full of mysteries, cover-ups, and bizarre events that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Some of them are funny, some are tragic, and some are simply inexplicable. But all of them remind us that reality is often stranger than fiction, and that the most important stories are sometimes the ones that seem too weird to be true. Keep questioning, keep investigating, and keep an open mind about the strange and wonderful complexity of human experience, because you never know when you might stumble across the next great mystery that will keep historians puzzled for centuries to come. Until our paths cross again in the realm of the bizarre and unexplained, sleep well, and remember, the truth is always stranger than we imagine.